The Galactic Empire stands as perhaps the most enduring symbol of tyranny in the galaxy's long and tumultuous history. For 24 years, an iron fist gripped countless star systems, crushing freedom beneath the weight of authoritarian rule. The story of the Empire begins not with a military coup or violent revolution, but with something far more insidious: a patient, methodical manipulation that transformed democracy into dictatorship with the stroke of a pen. This is the complete timeline of the Empire's reign. From its calculated inception through the Clone Wars to its spectacular collapse, this is how one man's ambition reshaped the galaxy and how that galaxy fought back. The Phantom Menace, seeds of manipulation, long before stormtroopers marched through the streets of occupied worlds, before the Death Star brought terror to the stars, the seeds of the Empire were being carefully planted in the fertile soil of the Galactic Republic. The year was 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, and the Republic that had stood for over 1,000 years was beginning to show cracks in its foundation. The Galactic Republic was ancient beyond measure. For millennia, it had maintained peace across countless systems through democratic principles and the watchful protection of the Jedi Order. But time had made the Republic complacent. Its Senate had grown bloated with bureaucracy, corruption seeped through its institutions, and the very systems meant to protect democracy had become tools for those who knew how to manipulate them. On the peaceful world of Naboo, a crisis was unfolding. The Trade Federation, a massive commercial entity with its own droid armies, had blockaded the planet in a dispute over taxation of trade routes. Negotiations failed. The Jedi were sent to mediate, but the situation spiraled rapidly into an armed invasion. The Trade Federation's battle droids marched through Naboo cities, their lifeless mechanical precision a harbinger of the cold military efficiency that would one day characterize the Empire itself. What the galaxy didn't know was that this crisis was no accident. Behind the scenes, pulling strings that stretched from Naboo to the highest chambers of the Republic's Senate, a Sith Lord operated in perfect secrecy. His name was Darth Sidious, and his public face was that of a concerned senator named Sheev Palpatine, representative of the very world under attack. Palpatine was everything a senator should be, at least on the surface. Soft-spoken, reasonable, always advocating for peace and democracy. He presented himself as a humble servant of his people, reluctant to seek greater power but willing to shoulder any burden for the good of the galaxy. This carefully constructed facade masked one of the most brilliant and ruthless minds in galactic history. The Sith had been thought extinct for a millennium. The Jedi believed they had destroyed the ancient order of dark-side wielders, that the threat had been eliminated forever. They were wrong. The Sith had simply gone into hiding, operating through the shadows, building their strength through 1,000 years of patient planning. They followed what was known as the rule of 2-1 master to hold the power, one apprentice to crave it. This ensured that only the strongest Sith survived, that their knowledge was preserved without the infighting that had once destroyed them. Darth Sidious was the heir to this millennium of Sith planning. He had trained under Darth Plagueis, a Sith Lord so powerful he could manipulate the Force to create life and prevent death itself. When Sidious had learned all he could from his master, he did what all Sith apprentices eventually did. He killed him, claiming the title of Dark Lord of the Sith for himself and taking on an apprentice of his own, a Zabrak warrior named Darth Maul. But Sidious knew that brute force alone would never defeat the Jedi and conquer the Republic. The Jedi were too numerous, too powerful. The Republic's military might, even diminished as it was, would crush any conventional army. No, the key to victory lay not in destroying the Republic from without, but in corrupting it from within. The crisis on Naboo was the first move in a game that would span decades. Palpatine manipulated his homeworld's queen, the young Padmé Amidala, with masterful precision. He presented himself as her ally, her friend, someone who shared her concern for Naboo's people. When she expressed frustration with the Republic Senate's inability to help her occupied world, he gently suggested a bold move, a vote of no confidence against the Supreme Chancellor, Finis Valorum. Valorum was a good man, but he was weak. The bureaucracy of the Republic had grown so vast, so tangled, that even a chancellor with the best intentions couldn't cut through it. Palpatine knew this. He'd ensured Valorum's ineffectiveness by working quietly behind the scenes for years, supporting the very systems and regulations that now paralyzed the Chancellor's ability to act. When Queen Amidala called for the vote of no confidence before the full Senate, Palpatine appeared reluctant, even hesitant. He spoke of his old friend the Chancellor with apparent sadness, but the vote proceeded and Valorum fell. In the chaos that followed, as various senators positioned themselves to seize the chancellorship, Palpatine emerged as the sympathetic choice. He was from a world in crisis. He'd advocated for peace. He seemed reluctant to accept the nomination. The Senate, moved by what they perceived as humility and dedication, elected him Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic. It was a masterwork of manipulation. Palpatine had orchestrated the invasion of his own homeworld, used that crisis to topple the standing government, and positioned himself to fill the power vacuum, all while appearing to be nothing more than a concerned public servant who'd been thrust into a role he didn't want. The Naboo crisis was resolved, the Trade Federation's leaders captured, and the galaxy breathed a sigh of relief. The Republic had shown it could still function. A new chancellor was in place, young Queen Amidala had proven herself a capable leader, and the Jedi had uncovered the existence of the Sith, putting them on alert. But Palpatine had won. He now sat in the highest office of the Galactic Republic, with virtually unlimited time to implement his plans. The Jedi knew the Sith had returned, but they didn't know which Sith Lord they'd encountered was the master and which was the apprentice. Darth Maul had been cut down by Obi-Wan Kenobi during the Battle of Naboo, but somewhere out there, another Sith Lord remained hidden. The Jedi searched for the missing Sith Lord, never suspecting that he sat among them in the Senate, smiled at them in the hallways, consulted with them on matters of Republic security.
Palpatine had achieved the perfect camouflage, hiding in plain sight at the very center of power.
The Clone Wars, Palpatine's grand design for 10 years after the Battle of Naboo, Chancellor Palpatine carefully consolidated his position. He was re-elected to a second term, something that should have raised concerns given the traditional reluctance of Republic chancellors to serve more than one term, but Palpatine made it seem necessary. The Republic was facing new challenges, he argued. Continuity and leadership would help navigate these troubled times. Those troubles were not accidents. They were manufactured with the same care that had gone into the Naboo crisis. Across the galaxy, thousands of star systems were growing dissatisfied with the Republic. They saw corruption, inefficiency, and a government that seemed to serve the core worlds while ignoring the outer rim. Their complaints were valid, and Palpatine ensured they grew louder. A movement emerged called the Separatist Alliance. Led by former Jedi Count Dooku, who now secretly served Palpatine as the Sith Lord Darth Tyrannus, the Separatists demanded independence from the Republic. They built an army of battle droids, amassed a fleet of warships, and prepared for the possibility of armed conflict. The Republic found itself in a crisis. The Jedi Order numbered only about 10,000 knights and masters. They were peacekeepers, not soldiers, and even with their force abilities, they couldn't defend thousands of star systems against a massive droid army. The Republic itself had no standing military. For 1,000 years there had been no need for one. This was exactly what Palpatine had planned. He'd created a problem that only he could solve. Years earlier, a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas had foreseen trouble on the horizon. Concerned about the Republic's lack of military readiness, he had secretly commissioned the creation of a clone army on the remote world of Kamino. Sifo Dyas had been acting without the Council's approval, driven by visions of future conflict. He didn't live to see his army completed. Dooku, then already serving Palpatine's grand design, had arranged the Jedi Master's death. The clone army on Kamino grew in secret for a decade, funded through channels that ultimately led back to Palpatine's network of shadowy supporters. The clones were created from the genetic template of a bounty hunter named Jango Fett, chosen for his combat prowess and lack of personal connections. They were raised in accelerated growth chambers, trained from birth for war, and programmed with absolute obedience. To the Republic, more importantly, they were programmed with something else. Deep in their brain chemistry, the Kaminoans had installed behavioral modification biochips. These chips contained protocols for various contingencies, military orders that could be activated with simple spoken commands. Protocol 65 dealt with removing a chancellor who'd gone rogue. Protocol 66 was different. It identified the Jedi as traitors to the Republic and ordered their immediate execution. Palpatine had ensured the creation of an army he could turn against the Jedi at the moment of his choosing. When the discovery of this clone army was revealed to the Senate, Palpatine feigned surprise and concern. But he also pointed out the fortunate timing. The Separatists were building their forces. The Republic needed defenders. Here was an army ready and waiting, commissioned by a Jedi Master who'd foreseen this very need. Surely it was the will of the Force? The Senate debated creating a grand army of the Republic. But many senators opposed the militarization of their democracy. Padme Amidala, now a senator herself, led the opposition to what was called the Military Creation Act. She remembered well how fear had been used to manipulate the Senate during the Naboo crisis. She saw the danger in giving the Republic an army. Then the Separatist crisis erupted into open conflict on the world of Geonosis. The Jedi discovered a Separatist plot, launched a rescue mission, and found themselves vastly outnumbered by droid forces. Hundreds of Jedi were surrounded, facing annihilation. At that critical moment, Clone Master Yoda arrived with the Grand Army of the Republic. The Senate, faced with the reality of Jedi deaths and Separatist aggression, granted Palpatine emergency powers to use the clone army and do whatever was necessary to preserve the Republic. It was exactly what he'd orchestrated. The Clone Wars had begun, and Palpatine now had both the legal authority to wage war and an army absolutely loyal to his commands. The Clone Wars raged for 3 years. They consumed the galaxy in a conflict unlike anything seen for a millennium. The Jedi, who had been peacekeepers, became generals leading clone armies into battle. The Republic Senate, which had been a deliberative body, became a rubber stamp for emergency decrees. And Palpatine, who'd been a humble public servant, became the most powerful political figure in 1,000 years. With each new crisis, Palpatine gained more authority. The Senate granted him extended terms in office, removing the traditional limits on a chancellor's power. They gave him control over the Jedi Council's operations, requiring the order to clear major decisions through his office. They allowed him to appoint governors and regional authorities with sweeping powers, bypassing local governments. All of it was done legally, through proper votes and procedures. That was the brilliance of Palpatine's plan. He wasn't conquering the Republic through force. He was transforming it through its own democratic processes, using fear and crisis to make people willingly surrender their freedoms in exchange for the promise of security. Throughout the war, Palpatine played both sides with extraordinary skill. As Chancellor of the Republic, he directed the clone army and the Jedi in their campaigns against the Separatists. As Darth Sidious, he commanded Count Dooku and the Separatist leadership, ensuring the conflict continued but never achieved total victory for either side. The war needed to rage on, needed to exhaust the galaxy, needed to make people desperate for any solution that would bring it to an end. He also cultivated a special relationship with a young Jedi Knight named Anakin Skywalker. Anakin was the chosen one, prophesied to bring balance to the Force, and his potential in the Force was unlike anything the Jedi had seen in generations. Palpatine had been watching Anakin since the boy's arrival at the Jedi Temple as a child. He'd befriended him, mentored him, always operating just within the bounds of propriety but constantly working to drive a wedge between Anakin and the Jedi Council. Anakin was powerful but troubled. The Jedi had taken him in too late, after he'd already formed attachments. He'd left behind his mother on Tatooine, and that loss haunted him. When he fell in love with Padme Amidala and married her in secret, he violated the Jedi Code's prohibitions on attachment. These conflicts, these violations of Jedi teachings, made Anakin vulnerable to manipulation. Palpatine exploited every crack in Anakin's faith in the Jedi. He praised the young knight's abilities while suggesting the Council held him back. He sympathized with Anakin's frustrations while planting seeds of doubt about the Jedi's wisdom. He positioned himself as a father figure, someone who believed in Anakin without reservation, while the Council constantly questioned and tested him. The Clone Wars ground on, and with each passing year the galaxy grew more exhausted. Billions died. Entire worlds were devastated. The Jedi spread themselves thin, trying to be everywhere at once, leading clone troopers in battles across 1,000 systems. They became soldiers, and in becoming soldiers they moved further from their role as peacekeepers and guardians of the Force. Palpatine watched and waited. He'd created the perfect storm. The Jedi were spread across the galaxy, away from Coruscant, embedded with clone armies that secretly awaited his command to turn on them. The Senate had granted him virtually unlimited power. The galaxy was desperate for the war to end and would accept almost any solution. Everything was in place. All he needed was the final piece, a new Sith apprentice to replace Count Dooku. Darth Maul had been powerful, but ultimately just a weapon. Dooku had been useful for his political connections and his ability to lead the Separatists, but he was too old, too set in his ways. Palpatine needed someone younger, more powerful, someone who could be molded into the perfect enforcer for his new empire. He needed Anakin Skywalker. The final year of the Clone Wars saw the conflict reach new heights of desperation. The Separatists, under the command of General Grievous, launched a daring attack on Coruscant itself. The Republic capital came under siege, and in the chaos, Chancellor Palpatine was kidnapped and held aboard the Separatist flagship. The Jedi Council dispatched Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker to rescue the Chancellor. What followed was a carefully orchestrated final test of Anakin's loyalty. Aboard the ship, Anakin and Obi-Wan confronted Count Dooku. In the ensuing duel, Anakin defeated the Sith Lord, disarming him and bringing him to his knees. Palpatine, playing the role of terrified prisoner perfectly, urged Anakin to kill Dooku. It went against the Jedi Code. A Jedi was supposed to capture enemies, not execute helpless prisoners. But Palpatine whispered that Dooku was too dangerous to be left alive, that he deserved death for his crimes. Anakin, still riding the adrenaline of combat, still remembering all the suffering Dooku had caused, struck off the Sith Lord's head. The moment Anakin committed that act, the moment he executed a helpless prisoner on Palpatine's urging, another chain was forged binding him to the dark side. They rescued Palpatine and returned to Coruscant, but Anakin was troubled by what he'd done. The Chancellor assured him it was necessary, that these were difficult times requiring difficult choices. Meanwhile, Anakin had another burden weighing on him. Padme was pregnant, and he'd been having terrible visions of her dying in childbirth. These nightmares consumed him, driving him to desperate thoughts. The Jedi Code taught that death was a natural part of life, that one should train themselves to let go of everything they feared to lose. But Anakin couldn't accept that. He couldn't lose Padme. He would do anything, sacrifice anything to save her. Palpatine sensed this desperation and made his move. He revealed to Anakin the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a Sith Lord so powerful he could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life and prevent people from dying. It was a power the Jedi couldn't teach him, Palpatine explained, because the Jedi were too dogmatic, too afraid of the dark side to explore its full potential. The trap was set. All Palpatine had to do was wait for Anakin to walk into it. The Jedi Council, meanwhile, had grown increasingly suspicious of the Chancellor. He'd held office far beyond normal terms, accumulated unprecedented power, and showed no signs of relinquishing his emergency authority even as the war neared its end. They began to suspect that Palpatine might be the Sith Lord they'd been searching for since Darth Maul's appearance on Naboo. In a controversial decision, the Council assigned Anakin to spy on Palpatine. They asked him to report on the Chancellor's activities, to betray the trust of the man who'd been his friend and mentor. This drove yet another wedge between Anakin and the Jedi, exactly as Palpatine had intended. General Grievous was tracked to the planet Utapau, and Obi-Wan was dispatched to deal with him. With Obi-Wan off-world, Palpatine made his final play. He revealed to Anakin his true identity as Darth Sidious, the Dark Lord of the Sith. But he didn't attack Anakin or try to convert him through force. Instead, he simply told him the truth and waited. Anakin was torn. He reported Palpatine's identity to Mace Windu and the Jedi Council. Fulfilling his duty as a Jedi, Master Windu assembled a team to arrest the Chancellor, and they confronted him in his office. In the ensuing battle, Palpatine killed 3 of the 4 Jedi Masters in moments, revealing combat abilities that belied his elderly appearance.
Only Mace Windu survived, and the two engaged in a ferocious duel.
Meanwhile, Anakin struggled with his decision. If the Jedi killed Palpatine, the knowledge of how to prevent death would die with him. Padme would die. Unable to accept that outcome, Anakin rushed to the Chancellor's office just as Mace Windu was about to deliver a killing blow. Anakin intervened, cutting off Windu's hand and allowing Palpatine to strike down the Jedi Master with Force lightning. In that moment, Anakin made his choice. He knelt before Palpatine and pledged himself to the Sith, becoming Darth Vader, servant of the dark side. Palpatine's first command was brutal and absolute. Anakin was to lead the 501st Legion of Clone Troopers to the Jedi Temple and kill everyone inside. Jedi, younglings, support staff, everyone. The temple had to fall, the Jedi Order had to be destroyed, and Anakin would lead the attack personally. While Anakin marched on the temple, Palpatine enacted the order he'd been preparing for years. He contacted clone commanders across the galaxy and spoke 2 words: execute Order 66. The behavioral modification chips activated. Clones who had fought beside Jedi for 3 years, who had formed bonds and friendships with their generals, suddenly turned on them without hesitation. On planet after planet, in the midst of battles and victories, Jedi Knights and Masters fell to blaster fire from the soldiers they'd trusted with their lives. Master Plo Koon was shot down over Cato Nymodia. Kayla Secura was gunned down by her own troopers on Felucia. Ki Adi Mundi fell fighting his betrayers on Maigito. Across the galaxy, the Jedi Order was decimated in a matter of hours. 10,000 Jedi, the guardians of peace and justice for a millennium, were massacred. Some survived. Yoda felt the deaths of his fellow Jedi through the Force and killed the clones who attempted to execute him. Obi-Wan survived the betrayal on Utapau and witnessed the temple's destruction. A handful of others escaped, scattered across the galaxy, hunted and in hiding. With the Jedi eliminated and the Separatist leadership murdered by Anakin on Mustafar, Palpatine stood before the Galactic Senate. His face bore the scars of his battle with Mace Windu, grotesquely disfigured by his own Force lightning. He used this appearance to his advantage, claiming the Jedi had attempted to assassinate him and overthrow the Republic.
The Senate, shaken by reports of Jedi attacks on clone troopers across the galaxy, believed him.
Palpatine described a vast Jedi conspiracy to seize control of the government. He spoke of their arrogance, their dangerous religion, their plot to end democracy. And then he announced his solution. The Clone Wars were over. The Separatist leadership was dead. The Jedi coup had been thwarted. And to ensure such threats never emerged again, to bring order and security to the galaxy, the Republic would be reorganized. It would become the first Galactic Empire. The Senate erupted in thunderous applause. A few senators, including Bail Organa and Mon Mothma, looked on in horror. Senator Padme Amidala, carrying Anakin's children, whispered what would become a defining observation. "So this is how liberty dies." With thunderous applause, Palpatine became Emperor, and the Republic died. Democracy, which had endured for over 1,000 years, ended not through violent conquest, but through legal procedures, emergency powers, and the manipulation of fear. The people of the galaxy welcomed the Empire, believing it would bring the security and stability they'd been promised.
The early Imperial era, consolidation of power, the transition from Republic to Empire happened with shocking speed.
Within days of Palpatine's declaration, new edicts were flowing from the Imperial Palace, restructuring every aspect of galactic governance. What had been the Grand Army of the Republic became the Imperial military. Clone troopers continued to serve, though Palpatine had already begun secretly phasing them out in favor of recruited soldiers who would form the first generation of stormtroopers. The Jedi were declared enemies of the state. Their property was seized, their temple on Coruscant converted into the Imperial Palace. The Jedi archives containing millennia of knowledge were raided and partially destroyed, with the most dangerous texts being kept for the Emperor's personal collection.
Palpatine wanted the Jedi erased not just physically, but from history itself.
Across the galaxy, Imperial Inquisitors were deployed. These were former Jedi who had either fallen to the dark side or been captured and turned through torture and manipulation. Led by the Grand Inquisitor, they hunted the surviving Jedi with brutal efficiency. The Inquisitors were granted extraordinary authority to requisition Imperial resources and pursue their quarry across any world in the Empire. The Senate remained at least nominally.
Palpatine initially maintained the democratic facade, allowing the Senate to continue its sessions while quietly stripping it of real power.
Senators found their proposals blocked by Imperial bureaucracy, their authorities superseded by regional governors appointed directly by the Emperor.
The Senate became a symbol of the old Republic, maintained to give people the illusion of representation while holding no actual influence.
Darth Vader emerged as the Emperor's enforcer, his black armor and mechanized breathing becoming symbols of Imperial power throughout the galaxy. The former Anakin Skywalker had been grievously wounded in a duel with Obi-Wan Kenobi on Mustafar, left to burn alive on the volcanic planet's shores.
Palpatine had rescued him, rebuilt him with cybernetic implants and life support systems, and transformed him into a more machine than man.
Vader's true identity was known to very few. To most of the galaxy, he was simply the Emperor's mysterious enforcer, a Dark Lord who commanded legions and struck fear into anyone who opposed Imperial rule. His command over the Force, his willingness to kill without hesitation, and his absolute loyalty to the Emperor made him the perfect tool for Palpatine's will. The early years of the Empire saw rapid expansion of Imperial authority. Systems that had been separatist were brought to heel through military occupation. Planets that had supported the Republic found Imperial governors installed, superseding their local governments. Any resistance was crushed with overwhelming force. New technologies of control were implemented. The Empire built massive star destroyers, warships so large and powerful that their mere presence in orbit of a world was usually sufficient to maintain order. These kilometer-long vessels bristled with weapons and carried thousands of troops. A single star destroyer could blockade a planet or wage war against an entire system. Stormtroopers became the face of Imperial authority on occupied worlds. Clad in white armor, their faces hidden behind helmets, they represented the Empire's impersonal, mechanized approach to control. Unlike the clone troopers before them, these were recruited soldiers, humans from across the galaxy who joined the Imperial military for various reasons ranging from patriotism to simple economic necessity. The Empire promoted a doctrine of human superiority, while the Republic had celebrated diversity, welcoming countless species into government and society. The Empire increasingly relegated non-humans to second-class status. Imperial officers were almost exclusively human. Leadership positions went to humans. Alien species found themselves subject to discriminatory laws and practices. This speciesism served multiple purposes for Palpatine. It created an underclass that could be exploited for labor. It gave the human majority a group to feel superior to, directing their frustrations downward rather than at the government. And it fostered division, making it harder for different species to unite against Imperial rule. The economy was reorganized to serve the military-industrial complex. Massive corporations that built warships, weapons, and military equipment found themselves favored with government contracts. Smaller businesses struggled under the weight of Imperial regulations and taxation. Entire worlds were converted into factory planets, their populations pressed into service building the machinery of Imperial dominance. Slavery, which had been outlawed by the Republic, returned in all but name. The Empire used conscript labor, forced work details, and prison sentences to acquire cheap manpower for its massive construction projects. The distinction between this and traditional slavery was largely semantic, and on many worlds, even that pretense was abandoned. Palpatine moved quickly to consolidate his Sith legacy while destroying any potential rivals. He claimed the ancient Sith homeworld of Moraband, formerly known as Korriban, as a place of dark side power where he could meditate and grow stronger. He sought out Sith holocrons and artifacts from across the galaxy, adding them to his collection of dark knowledge.
Any Force-sensitive children were identified and either recruited into the Inquisitorius or eliminated.
Palpatine wanted no new Jedi Order rising to challenge him, but he also saw potential tools in those with Force sensitivity. Some were trained as Inquisitors. Others became Imperial agents with enhanced abilities. A few were experimented on. Their midi-chlorian count studied as Palpatine continued his master's work in understanding the scientific basis of the Force. The Emperor ruled through fear, but also through bureaucracy. He created a vast imperial apparatus with overlapping jurisdictions and competing power centers. The Imperial Security Bureau watched over the military. The military watched over planetary governors. The governors competed with sector moffs. The moffs reported to Grand Moffs, who in turn served at the Emperor's pleasure. This system ensured that no single individual or institution could accumulate enough power to threaten Palpatine. Everyone was checking everyone else. Ambitious officers advanced by reporting on their rivals' incompetence or disloyalty. Failure was often rewarded with execution, encouraging a culture where success came through destroying others rather than through cooperation. For most citizens of the galaxy, the transition to empire was less dramatic than one might expect.
If you kept your head down, paid your taxes, and didn't question imperial authority, life continued much as it had before.
The Empire promised security and delivered it through overwhelming military presence. Trade routes that had been dangerous under the Republic became safe under the Empire's iron control. This was part of Palpatine's genius. The Empire wasn't universally hated, at least not at first. Many people genuinely believed it was an improvement over the corruption and inefficiency of the late Republic. The Clone Wars had traumatized the galaxy, and the Empire promised no such conflict would ever happen again. For systems that had suffered during the war, that promise was worth supporting. But beneath the surface order, seeds of resistance were already being planted. Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, and other former senators who'd opposed Palpatine's transformation began making quiet contacts. Surviving Jedi went into hiding, but didn't give up hope. On countless worlds, people who valued freedom over security started asking dangerous questions. The Empire's true nature was becoming clear to those willing to see it. The mass arrests of political dissidents, the brutal put-downs of peaceful protests, the growing list of species and cultures targeted for special persecution. World by world, the costs of imperial rule were mounting, and those costs were paid in the blood and freedom of the galaxy's citizens.
Palpatine sat at the center of this vast web of power, growing stronger in the dark side with each passing year.
He had achieved what no Sith Lord in history had managed, the complete domination of the known galaxy. The Jedi were destroyed. Democracy was dead.
And he ruled as Emperor, with no one capable of challenging his authority.
But power always breeds resistance. The tighter the Empire's grip became, the more star systems would slip through its fingers. The Death Star project, the ultimate weapon. Even as the Empire solidified its control over the galaxy, Palpatine was planning for an even more absolute form of dominance. The Emperor understood that military force alone, no matter how overwhelming, could never completely eliminate resistance. There would always be systems on the edge of Imperial control, always be pockets of rebellion that could be contained but not eliminated. What he needed was something more than military superiority. He needed terror. The concept of a planet-destroying battle station had been in development since before the Clone Wars even ended. The plans had been designed by Geonosian engineers, refined by brilliant minds pressed into Imperial service, and overseen by Director Orson Krennic of the Imperial Military Department of Advanced Weapons Research. The weapon was codenamed the Death Star, and it would become the ultimate symbol of Imperial might. Building such a massive space station required resources on an unprecedented scale. The Death Star measured 160 kilometers in diameter, large enough to be mistaken for a small moon. Its construction required the mining of entire asteroid fields, the exploitation of worlds rich in metals and rare materials. Slave labor from conquered systems was conscripted to work on the project. Thousands died in the construction alone, casualties that didn't even make it into the official records. The station's primary weapon was a superlaser powered by massive kyber crystals, the same crystals that had once been used to create Jedi lightsabers. The Empire had seized the moon Jedha, sacred to those who believed in the Force, and stripped it of its kyber deposits. These crystals, aligned and amplified through technology that married science with dark side manipulation, could generate a beam powerful enough to destroy an entire planet with a single shot.
The Death Star project consumed the better part of 20 years.
Construction was carried out in secret at various locations, with the final assembly taking place in the orbit of Geonosis. The Geonosians who had designed the station were subsequently exterminated, their hive world sterilized to ensure the project's secrecy. An entire species was wiped out to protect the Empire's superweapon. Security around the project was absolute. Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin, one of Palpatine's most trusted officers, oversaw the final stages of construction. Tarkin was a true believer in the power of fear to maintain order. He'd authored what became known as the Tarkin Doctrine, which argued that the threat of force was often more useful than force itself. The Death Star was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Not everyone in the Imperial hierarchy was comfortable with the project. Some saw it as a waste of resources that could have been spent on more practical military assets. Others worried about the political implications of possessing a weapon that could destroy worlds. These concerns were dismissed or ignored. Palpatine wanted the Death Star, and the Emperor's will was absolute. The weapon's development was not without setbacks. The superlaser required precise calibration, and early tests resulted in catastrophic failures. The station's defensive systems had to be constantly updated as new threats were identified, and there was the matter of the thermal exhaust port, a necessary but vulnerable access point in the station's architecture. Galen Erso, the scientist who designed the superlaser, had built a vulnerability into the system. A chain reaction could be triggered if the reactor was struck precisely. This information was smuggled out by Erso's daughter and fell into rebel hands, but we'll return to that thread of the story later. While the Death Star was under construction, the Empire continued to tighten its grip on the galaxy.
Palpatine dissolved the Imperial Senate in the year of the Death Star's completion, declaring that the regional governors would now have direct control over their territories.
The Senate had been rendered toothless years earlier, but its complete elimination sent a clear message: the last remnant of democracy was dead. The Emperor made this announcement with characteristic political calculation. He timed it to coincide with the Death Star becoming operational, ensuring that any systems considering rebellion would face not just the dissolution of their representation, but also the knowledge that a planet-destroying battle station was now active. The Death Star's first public deployment was meant to be a demonstration that would cow the entire galaxy into submission. A planet would be destroyed, the Empire's enemies would see the futility of resistance, and order would reign supreme. Tarkin personally selected the target, Alderaan, a peaceful core world known for its beauty, culture, and support of the Rebel Alliance. Princess Leia Organa of Alderaan, adopted daughter of Bail Organa and a secret leader of the rebellion, was captured carrying stolen Death Star plans. She was brought aboard the battle station and interrogated. When she refused to reveal the location of the rebel base, Tarkin threatened to destroy her homeworld. Leia, desperate to save her people, gave him the coordinates of an abandoned rebel base on Dantooine. Tarkin, in a display of cold cruelty that defined Imperial rule, ordered Alderaan destroyed anyway. The planet's 2 billion inhabitants had mere seconds to comprehend their fate before the Death Star's superlaser struck. Alderaan shattered its continents, breaking apart, its cities vaporizing, its people dying instantly. In a single moment, billions of lives ended, and one of the galaxy's most beautiful worlds became an asteroid field. The destruction of Alderaan was meant to terrify the galaxy into submission. Instead, it galvanized resistance. Systems that had been undecided about the Empire saw the true nature of the regime they served. The Death Star wasn't a deterrent. It was a weapon of genocide, and Palpatine was willing to use it without hesitation. For the first time, the Empire had overplayed its hand. Destroying Alderaan didn't demonstrate power. It demonstrated madness, tyranny without limit or reason. If a peaceful world like Alderaan could be destroyed on a whim, then no one was safe. Compliance offered no protection. The only choice left was to fight or accept inevitable destruction. But the Death Star's reign of terror would be shorter than anyone expected. The plans that Leia had been carrying, stolen at great cost by rebel operatives, revealed the station's weakness. And in the backwater deserts of Tatooine, a young moisture farmer named Luke Skywalker was about to be swept into a conflict that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The Empire had reached the height of its power. The Emperor ruled from Coruscant, his word absolute. Darth Vader commanded fleets and struck fear across 1,000 systems. The Death Star promised the ability to destroy any world that dared resist. The Jedi were extinct, the Senate dissolved, and organized resistance seemed impossible. The machinery of Imperial control operated with terrifying efficiency. Every day, billions of beings lived under the Empire's authority, their lives shaped by decisions made in distant command centers and throne rooms. Imperial tax collectors extracted wealth from conquered worlds. Imperial customs agents controlled all trade between systems. Imperial law superseded local traditions and customs, imposing uniformity across a galaxy that had celebrated diversity for millennia. The culture of the Empire reflected Palpatine's dark vision. Art and music were heavily censored, with any work criticizing the regime banned outright. History was rewritten to portray the Republic as corrupt and failing, the Jedi as dangerous religious fanatics, and the Emperor as the benevolent savior who'd restored order from chaos. Education systems taught Imperial doctrine, training children to serve the state without question. Propaganda saturated every level of Imperial society. The HoloNet broadcast constant messages about the Empire's greatness, the wisdom of the Emperor, and the necessity of obeying Imperial authority. News reports portrayed any resistance as terrorism, criminals disrupting the peace-loving Empire. The very language of political discourse was manipulated to make opposition difficult to articulate. Freedom became slavery. War became peace, ignorance became strength. The Empire's economic system was designed to funnel wealth toward the military-industrial complex and Imperial elite. Small businesses struggled under oppressive regulations, clearly written to favor large corporations with connections to Imperial officials. Entire sectors of the economy became monopolized by companies that had supported Palpatine's rise to power. The free market the Republic had maintained was replaced by a system of cronyism and corruption that benefited those loyal to the regime. Labor conditions deteriorated across the galaxy. With no meaningful worker protections and the constant threat of being replaced by droids or slave labor, ordinary workers had little negotiating power. Strikes were met with brutal suppression. Labor organizers were arrested as troublemakers and disappeared into the Imperial prison system. The standard of living for average citizens declined even as those at the top of the Imperial hierarchy accumulated unprecedented wealth. The environmental cost of Imperial rule was staggering. Entire planets were stripped of resources to feed the Empire's military machine. Ecosystems were destroyed without regard for long-term sustainability. Mining operations scarred worlds. leaving behind toxic wastelands. The Empire's philosophy extended to nature itself: domination, exploitation, and control, without concern for consequences or balance. Individual star systems that had once governed themselves now found every major decision controlled by Imperial bureaucrats who'd never visited their worlds and didn't understand their cultures. Local governors were appointed by the Emperor rather than elected by citizens. These governors answered to regional moffs, who answered to grand moffs, who answered only to Palpatine. The layers of bureaucracy ensured that concerns from ordinary citizens rarely reached anyone with the authority to address them. The judicial system became a mockery of justice. Imperial courts served the state rather than fairness. Judges were appointed based on loyalty to the Empire rather than legal expertise. Trials were perfunctory affairs with predetermined outcomes. The accused had no real rights, no meaningful ability to defend themselves. Sentencing was arbitrary and cruel, designed to instill fear rather than to reform or rehabilitate. Prisons became holding pens for anyone who'd opposed the Empire in even minor ways. Political prisoners filled cells alongside criminals. Conditions were deliberately harsh, calculated to break the spirit of inmates. Torture was routine, justified as necessary for extracting information or simply punishing those who dared to resist. Many prisoners simply disappeared, their families never learning what happened to them. The isolation of Force-sensitive children represented one of the Empire's most insidious programs. The Inquisitorius identified younglings with potential in the Force and either recruited them into Imperial service or eliminated them. Families who tried to hide Force-sensitive children faced collective punishment. Entire communities could be punished for harboring a single Jedi sympathizer. This created an atmosphere of paranoia where neighbors informed on neighbors, where trust became dangerous, where solidarity crumbled under the weight of self-preservation.
I do.
Yet in that moment of supreme confidence, the seeds of the Empire's downfall were already sprouting. The very excess of Imperial power, the arrogance that led to Alderaan's destruction, would unite disparate resistance movements into a genuine threat. And the Force, which Palpatine thought he'd bent entirely to his will, was awakening in a new generation. Every act of Imperial brutality created new enemies. Every destroyed world radicalized populations who might have remained neutral. Every innocent person arrested or killed became a martyr whose story inspired others to resist. The tighter Palpatine's grip became, the more determination it created in those who refused to submit to tyranny. On 1,000 worlds, in quiet acts of defiance invisible to Imperial surveillance, ordinary people kept hope alive. Parents told children stories of the old Republic. Teachers secretly educated students about true history rather than Imperial propaganda. Artists created works that celebrated freedom even if they could never be publicly shared. These small acts of resistance, multiplied across billions of beings, created a foundation for larger rebellion. The reign of the Empire had lasted only 19 years. In another 5, it would lie in ruins, brought down by the very forces it had tried to crush absolutely. The story of that fall begins at a rebel base on a jungle moon called Yavin 4, where hope survived against impossible odds, and a farm boy from Tatooine would fire the shot that proved the Emperor was not invincible. In the shadows of Imperial rule, resistance had never truly died. From the moment Palpatine declared himself Emperor, there were those who refused to accept the end of democracy. But for years, this resistance remained fragmented, isolated pockets of defiance that the Empire could crush individually with overwhelming force. What the galaxy needed was not scattered rebellions, but a unified rebellion capable of standing against the Empire. The seeds of organized resistance were planted by those who'd seen democracy die in the Senate. Bail Organa of Alderaan, Mon Mothma of Chandrila, and Garam Bel Iblis of Corellia began making careful contacts with like-minded senators and systems. They operated in absolute secrecy, knowing that discovery meant not just their own deaths, but the destruction of any hope for organized resistance. In the immediate aftermath of the Empire's formation, these early resistance leaders focused on survival and information gathering. They established secure communication channels, created safe houses for fugitives from Imperial justice, and began compiling evidence of Imperial crimes. They operated less as a military force and more as an intelligence network, learning the Empire's weaknesses while slowly building support. The Jedi survivors played a crucial role in these early days. Though scattered and hunted, they represented living symbols of resistance against the Emperor's tyranny. Some went into deep hiding, abandoning their connection to the Force entirely to escape detection by the Inquisitors. Others continued to fight, conducting guerrilla operations against Imperial targets while staying one step ahead of Vader's hunters. Kanan Jarrus and Hera Syndulla led one such cell on the outer rim world of Lothal.
Operating from a ship called the Ghost, their small crew conducted raids against Imperial facilities, freed prisoners, and provided hope to oppressed populations.
They were joined by a young Force sensitive named Ezra Bridger, whose potential caught the attention of both the Inquisitors and, eventually, Vader himself. The Ghost Crew's activities represented a pattern repeating across the galaxy. Small groups, some led by former Jedi, others by disillusioned Imperial officers or local resistance fighters, began harassing Imperial operations. These cells operated independently without coordination, but their cumulative effect was significant. The Empire could not be everywhere at once, and these guerrilla operations tied down resources and manpower. Saw Gerrera led one of the more extreme resistance movements, operating with such brutal tactics that even other resistance leaders kept their distance. Gerrera had fought against separatist forces during the Clone Wars, and he brought that same aggressive approach to fighting the Empire. His methods were controversial, but his effectiveness was undeniable. Imperial bases fell to his attacks, and his willingness to sacrifice anything for the cause inspired both admiration and fear. The destruction of Alderaan in 0BBY became the catalyst that transformed scattered resistance into unified rebellion. The sheer scale of Imperial brutality, the willingness to murder 2 billion people to make a political point, shocked even those who'd been reluctant to oppose the Empire directly. Systems that had remained neutral found themselves reassessing their position. If Alderaan could be destroyed, any world could be next. Mon Mothma made the formal declaration that united these various resistance movements into the Alliance to restore the Republic. She'd been operating in secret for years, but Alderaan's destruction forced her hand. The Empire's evil was now undeniable. The time for working within the system had passed. The only path forward was open rebellion. The Alliance formalized its structure quickly. Mon Mothma became the civilian leader, the public face of the rebellion representing its democratic ideals. Bail Organa served as a key advisor and supporter, though his role was complicated by his position as a member of the Imperial Senate, a body that existed in name only but still required careful navigation. Admiral Jial Akbar, a brilliant Mon Calamari strategist, assumed command of the Alliance fleet. The Rebel Alliance faced enormous challenges. The Empire controlled the vast majority of the galaxy's resources. Imperial shipyards produced star destroyers at a rate the Rebellion couldn't match. The Imperial army numbered in the billions. Against such odds, conventional warfare seemed impossible. The Alliance would have to fight smart, strike where the Empire was weak, and win through mobility and morale rather than raw military power. The Alliance fleet was assembled from whatever ships could be acquired. Decommissioned Republic vessels, outdated fighters, converted civilian craft, and the occasional defecting Imperial ship formed the core of Rebel naval power. The Mon Calamari contributed their unique star cruisers, vessels designed for exploration that were converted into warships. These ships became the backbone of the Rebel fleet, capable of going toe-to-toe with Imperial star destroyers despite being outgunned. Rebel starfighters became the Alliance's primary offensive weapon. The T-65 X-Wing starfighter, produced by Incom Corporation before Imperial control restricted such production, combined speed, shields, and firepower in a package that could challenge Imperial TIE fighters. While TIEs were cheap, fast, and maneuverable, they lacked shields and hyperdrives, making them dependent on carrier vessels. X-Wings could operate independently, strike at Imperial targets, and escape before reinforcements arrived. Y-Wing bombers, older and slower than X-Wings, provided the heavy firepower needed to destroy Imperial capital ships and installations. A-Wing interceptors served as scouts and fast attack craft. B-Wings, when they became available later, offered the ability to engage Imperial capital ships directly. Together, these starfighters gave the rebellion the ability to strike quickly, do significant damage, and withdraw before overwhelming Imperial forces could respond. The Alliance established bases on remote worlds, where Imperial presence was minimal. Yavin 4, a jungle moon orbiting a gas giant on the edge of explored space, became one of the first major Rebel bases. The moon's dense jungles and ancient Massassi temples provided both cover and facilities that could be converted into a military installation. From Yavin, the Alliance could coordinate operations across the Outer Rim while remaining relatively safe from Imperial detection. Recruitment was a constant challenge. The Alliance needed pilots, soldiers, technicians, and support staff, but openly recruiting would expose them to Imperial infiltration and attack. Most rebels joined through personal connections, brought in by friends or family already committed to the cause. Others defected from Imperial service, disillusioned by the atrocities they'd witnessed or been ordered to commit. The rebellion also faced questions of legitimacy. The Empire controlled the HoloNet, the galaxy's primary communication network, and used it to broadcast constant propaganda. Rebels were portrayed as terrorists, criminals, and traitors. The average citizen of the Empire saw news reports of rebel attacks on Imperial facilities, but wasn't told about the destruction of Alderaan or the countless other Imperial crimes. Convincing people that the Alliance represented hope rather than chaos was an ongoing struggle. Funding the rebellion required creative solutions. Some systems contributed secretly, sending funds through circuitous routes that hid their origins. Wealthy individuals sympathetic to the cause donated their fortunes. The Alliance also conducted operations to seize Imperial caches of credits or equipment. Every Star Destroyer captured or destroyed, every Imperial facility raided, provided resources the Alliance desperately needed. Intelligence gathering became crucial to rebel operations. Bothan spies, renowned for their skills in espionage, provided critical information about Imperial movements and plans. Other species contributed their own intelligence networks. The Alliance built a comprehensive spy operation that operated throughout Imperial space, identifying targets, warning of Imperial operations, and gathering the information needed to keep the rebellion alive. The psychological aspect of the rebellion was just as important as the military one. Every successful rebel operation, every Imperial installation destroyed, proved that the Empire could be resisted. The mere existence of the Alliance challenged Palpatine's narrative of inevitable Imperial dominance. Hope itself became a weapon, and the Alliance wielded it as effectively as any starfighter or blaster. By the time of the Battle of Yavin, the Rebel Alliance had transformed from a scattered resistance movement into a genuine military force. It was still vastly outmatched by the Empire, still operating from the shadows, still fighting a war it seemed impossible to win. But it was fighting, and that was enough. The Empire had believed that fear would prevent organized resistance. The destruction of Alderaan had proven that belief catastrophically wrong. The alliance to restore the Republic represented more than a military force. It was the embodiment of the idea that tyranny could be resisted, that freedom was worth fighting for regardless of the odds. As long as the rebellion existed, as long as its members continued to fight, Palpatine's empire was not invincible. And in a galaxy under Imperial boot, that flicker of hope was the most dangerous weapon of all. The Battle of Yavin, the Death Star's fall, when the stolen Death Star plans reached the Rebel Alliance through Princess Leia's actions and the sacrifice of many Rebel operatives, they represented both hope and desperate urgency. Analysis of the technical schematics revealed the impossible. The Empire's ultimate weapon had a vulnerability, a small thermal exhaust port, ray-shielded but accessible to starfighter weapons, led directly to the station's main reactor. A precise shot into that port would trigger a chain reaction that could destroy the entire battle station. But the rebellion faced an immediate crisis. Princess Leia had been captured aboard the Death Star, and though she'd been rescued by an unlikely group including Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, Chewbacca, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Empire had tracked them. A homing beacon on the Millennium Falcon had led Imperial forces directly to the Rebel base on Yavin 4. The Death Star was now in the Yavin system, moving into position to destroy the jungle moon that housed the Rebel headquarters. Grand Moff Tarkin, still flush with the successful destruction of Alderaan, saw the opportunity to eliminate the Rebel leadership in one devastating blow. The Death Star's approach was methodical, unhurried. Tarkin was confident that no force the Rebels possessed could threaten his battle station. The Rebel Alliance faced a terrible choice. They could evacuate Yavin 4, save their personnel but lose their base and allow the Death Star to continue its reign of terror. Or they could attempt the seemingly impossible, launch a direct assault on the battle station with the hope that starfighters could exploit the thermal exhaust port before the Death Star's super laser came into range. General Jan Dodona, the Alliance's military strategist, briefed the assembled pilots on the plan. The Death Star's defenses were designed to repel large-scale capital ship assaults. Its turbolaser batteries and defensive shields could vaporize cruisers and frigates with ease. But those same defenses had blind spots against small, fast-moving starfighters. The rebels would have to fly through the station's surface trenches, avoiding defensive fire, and strike the exhaust port with pinpoint precision. The pilots who volunteered for this mission knew it was essentially a suicide run. Even if they could navigate the Death Star's defenses, the target was impossibly small. Dodona described it as hitting a 2-meter-wide port while flying at attack speed through a defended trench. Computer targeting would help, but the shot would require skills beyond what most pilots possessed. Red Squadron, Gold Squadron, and Blue Squadron assembled for the attack. These were the Alliance's best pilots, veterans of countless engagements against Imperial forces. They flew X-Wings and Y-Wings, fighters that had been modified and maintained with whatever resources the rebellion could spare. Each pilot knew they were likely flying to their death, but none hesitated. Luke Skywalker, the young farm boy from Tatooine who'd stumbled into this conflict mere days earlier, flew as Red 5. His experience was limited to shooting womp rats in Beggar's Canyon, hardly the training one would expect for the most important military engagement in galactic history. But Luke had something the other pilots lacked. He was Force-sensitive, the son of Anakin Skywalker, though neither he nor anyone else present knew his true lineage. As the rebel fighters launched from Yavin 4, the Death Star continued its relentless approach. On the battle station's command deck, Grand Moff Tarkin watched with complete confidence. He'd considered launching TIE fighters to intercept the rebel attack, but dismissed the idea. The Death Star's defensive guns would be more than sufficient to handle a few dozen starfighters. Darth Vader, present aboard the station, was less certain. He sensed something in the Force, a disturbance that suggested these rebels might be more dangerous than they appeared. At his insistence, a small squadron of TIE fighters was prepared, though Tarkin's overconfidence meant they wouldn't launch until the battle was well underway.
The rebel fighters split into attack groups as they approached the Death Star.
The battle station's surface was a city-sized expanse of industrial architecture, gun batteries, and shield generators. As the fighters dove toward the surface, Imperial gunners opened fire, filling space with deadly turbolaser blasts. The rebels' speed and maneuverability kept most of them alive through the initial approach, but fighters began falling to the intense defensive fire. Gold Squadron flying Y-wings made the first attack run down the trench. Squadron leader Dutch Vander led his bombers through the narrow passage, dodging defensive fire while trying to line up a shot on the exhaust port. The trench run was even more difficult than anticipated. Turbolaser towers bracketed the passage, forcing the Y-wings to fly dangerously close to the trench walls to avoid being hit. Gold Squadron's run failed. The thermal exhaust port proved too small a target even for the bombers' targeting computers. As the Y-wings attempted to circle for another run, Darth Vader launched in his customized TIE Advanced fighter, accompanied by 2 wingmen. Vader's piloting skills and force sensitivity made him a devastating opponent. Within moments, he destroyed Gold Leader and eliminated the remaining Y-wings of Gold Squadron. Red Squadron took up the attack. Flying faster X-wings, they dove into the trench with Vader in pursuit. The Dark Lord demonstrated why he was feared across the galaxy, systematically destroying rebel fighters with cold precision. His connection to the Force allowed him to anticipate their movements, to place shots with perfect accuracy. Red Squadron's pilots died one by one, their sacrifice buying time for others to attempt the impossible shot. Luke began his run. Guided by Red Leader Garvin Drace and Biggs Darklighter, his childhood friend who'd joined the rebellion, the 2 experienced pilots provided cover as Luke focused on the target. His targeting computer tracked the exhaust port, calculating the precise moment to release his proton torpedoes. But Vader was closing from behind, systematically eliminating Luke's escorts. Red Leader fell to Vader's guns. Biggs died moments later, sacrificing himself to give Luke a few more seconds. The Death Star superlaser was almost in firing position. In moments it would have the power to destroy Yavin 4 and everything the rebellion had built. Then Luke heard a voice he'd thought lost forever. Obi-Wan Kenobi, who died aboard the Death Star to allow Luke and the others to escape, spoke through the Force. "Use the Force, Luke. Let go. Trust your feelings." Luke had been relying on his targeting computer, but now he switched it off, trusting instead in the mystical energy field that he was only beginning to understand. Vader, sensing the Force in his son, though not yet understanding who this young pilot was, prepared to fire the killing shot. But before he could pull the trigger, laser fire from above destroyed one of his wingmen and sent Vader's TIE Advance spinning out of control, eliminated from the battle. Han Solo had returned. The smuggler who'd claimed he was only in it for the money had brought the Millennium Falcon back at the crucial moment, unable to abandon his friends to their fate. With seconds remaining before the Death Star could fire, Luke released his proton torpedoes. Guided by the Force, the weapons streaked down the exhaust port with impossible precision. They struck the reactor at the exact vulnerable point. The chain reaction began immediately. Deep within the Death Star, systems began failing as the reactor's containment lost integrity. Tarkin, still confident in his invulnerable battle station, refused to evacuate even as his officers reported the reactor's critical failure. He died moments later when the entire Death Star exploded, a blast so massive it briefly outshone Yavin itself. Hundreds of thousands of Imperial personnel died in that explosion. Officers, stormtroopers, technicians, crew members, all vaporized in an instant. The Death Star, the symbol of Imperial invincibility, the weapon that was supposed to terrorize the galaxy into submission, became a field of expanding debris. Darth Vader, his TIE advanced, severely damaged but still spaceworthy, escaped the destruction and fled the system. Luke, Wedge Antilles, and a handful of other rebel pilots returned to Yavin 4 as heroes. They'd accomplished the impossible. Against odds that should have been insurmountable, they destroyed the Empire's ultimate weapon. The Battle of Yavin became a watershed moment in galactic history. The Rebel Alliance had proven it could strike at the heart of Imperial power and win. Systems across the galaxy that had been too afraid to resist the Empire saw that the Death Star could be destroyed, that Palpatine was not invincible. Recruitment to the Alliance surged. Funds and supplies poured in from systems that now believed the rebellion could actually win. For the Empire, the loss was catastrophic, both strategically and symbolically. 2 decades of construction, untold resources, and the Empire's most powerful weapon had been eliminated by a handful of starfighters. The myth of Imperial invincibility was shattered. More dangerously for Palpatine, the destruction proved that the Empire could be beaten, that resistance was not futile. The celebration on Yavin 4 was brief.
The Alliance knew the Empire would retaliate with overwhelming force.
Within hours of the Death Star's destruction, the rebels began evacuating their base, scattering to new locations where Imperial forces would have difficulty finding them. The battle had been won, but the war had only truly begun. Emperor Palpatine, learning of the Death Star's destruction from his throne room on Coruscant, realized he'd underestimated the Rebel Alliance. He'd believed fear would prevent organized resistance. He'd thought the Empire's technological superiority would be sufficient to crush any opposition. The Battle of Yavin proved both assumptions catastrophically wrong. Darth Vader received new orders. The Emperor wanted the rebel pilot who'd destroyed the Death Star found and captured. Vader, sensing the Force in that pilot, began an obsessive hunt across the galaxy. He deployed probe droids to thousands of systems, interrogated prisoners with brutal efficiency, and followed any lead that might reveal the rebels' location. The galaxy stood at a crossroads. The Empire remained vastly superior in military strength. Its fleets were larger, its armies better equipped, its resources nearly unlimited. But the rebellion had proven that size and power weren't everything. Hope, now rekindled across countless systems, was a force that could not be destroyed with turbolasers or superweapons. The destruction of the Death Star sent shockwaves through the Imperial hierarchy beyond just the military implications. For nearly 2 decades, the regime had operated on the principle that Imperial might was absolute, that resistance was futile, that the Emperor's vision was inevitable. The Battle of Yavin shattered that illusion. If a battle station that took 20 years and untold resources to build could be destroyed by a handful of starfighters, what else might be possible? Imperial morale suffered in ways that couldn't be quantified through casualty reports or strategic assessments. Officers who'd believed they served an invincible empire now questioned that assumption. Soldiers who'd joined the military for security and stability saw that the Empire could be beaten. Governors who'd maintained order through fear of overwhelming Imperial retaliation realized that fear might not be enough.
Testing them from many soldiers.
The propaganda machine went to overdrive, trying to control the narrative. Official reports claimed the Death Star had been sabotaged by traitors within Imperial ranks. The rebellion's role was minimized or denied entirely. Some broadcasts even suggested the station had been deliberately destroyed to eliminate corrupt elements within the military. But no amount of propaganda could hide the truth from those who'd witnessed the battle or its aftermath. Across the Empire, populations that had accepted Imperial rule as inevitable began reconsidering their positions. If the Death Star could fall, maybe the Empire itself wasn't permanent. Maybe resistance was possible after all. Systems that had cooperated with the regime out of fear rather than loyalty started making secret contacts with rebel cells. The trickle of defections from Imperial service became a steady stream. Luke Skywalker's destruction of the Death Star made him an instant legend throughout the rebellion. Stories spread about the farm boy from Tatooine who'd become a hero, the young pilot who'd accomplished what entire fleets couldn't achieve. For a resistance movement that operated on hope as much as military strength, Luke became a powerful symbol. He proved that anyone could make a difference, that you didn't need to be a career soldier or a trained warrior to change galactic history. But Luke himself struggled with his newfound fame. He'd gone from moisture farming to destroying the Empire's ultimate weapon in a matter of days. The Force that he'd barely begun to understand had guided his actions, but he had no training in how to use this mystical power, no teacher to explain what he was experiencing. The ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi appeared to him occasionally, offering guidance, but Luke needed more comprehensive instruction in the ways of the Force. Han Solo, despite his protests that he was only in the conflict for the money, found himself increasingly committed to the rebel cause. His rescue of Luke at the crucial moment of the Battle of Yavin had revealed something even the smuggler himself hadn't fully acknowledged. He cared about more than just credits and his own survival. The friendships he'd formed with Luke, Leia, and the others had changed him in ways he was only beginning to recognize. Princess Leia threw herself into rebuilding and expanding the Alliance. The victory at Yavin had proven the rebellion could win, but it had also exposed how vulnerable they remained. One base, one concentration of forces could be found and destroyed. The Alliance needed to become more decentralized, more distributed, harder to eliminate through any single strike. The Battle of Yavin marked the true beginning of the Galactic Civil War. What had been scattered resistance became organized rebellion. The Empire, which had believed itself unchallengeable, found itself fighting a war against enemies who refused to accept defeat. And in the Force, a new balance was beginning to emerge. As a young farm boy from Tatooine began learning the ways of the Jedi from an ancient master hiding on a remote swamp world. The war between Empire and Alliance would rage for 4 more years, consuming countless lives and determining the fate of trillions. Every battle, every skirmish, every act of resistance contributed to the ultimate outcome. The Death Star's destruction was just the beginning of a struggle that would reshape the entire galaxy. The Empire Strikes Back, Hoth and Vader's obsession. In the 3 years following the Battle of Yavin, the Galactic Civil War intensified across countless systems. The Rebel Alliance, emboldened by their stunning victory over the Death Star, launched increasingly bold operations against Imperial targets.
They captured Imperial facilities, liberated oppressed populations, and continued to prove that the Empire could be resisted.
But the Empire, commanded by an emperor who would accept nothing less than total victory, struck back with terrifying efficiency. Darth Vader's obsession with finding the rebel base and the pilot who destroyed the Death Star drove Imperial operations during this period. Vader understood that while the Alliance had won a significant victory at Yavin, they remained vulnerable. The rebels operated from hidden bases, relying on secrecy for survival. If their main base could be found and destroyed, if their leadership could be eliminated, the rebellion might collapse. The Dark Lord deployed thousands of probe droids across the galaxy. These automated reconnaissance units were programmed to search for signs of rebel activity. They landed on remote worlds, scanning for energy signatures, communication transmissions, or any evidence of military installations. It was a massive operation, consuming significant resources, but Vader was relentless in his pursuit. Meanwhile, the Rebel Alliance had established a new base on the ice planet Hoth, a frozen wasteland on the edge of explored space. The sixth planet in a remote system, Hoth was inhospitable to most life, its surface scoured by constant blizzards and temperatures that dropped to lethal levels. These very characteristics made it an ideal hiding place.
The Empire would never expect the rebels to establish a major base in such a hostile environment.
The Alliance carved Echo Base into the planet's ice, using Hoth's natural cave systems as the foundation for an extensive military installation. The base housed the Alliance fleet, command facilities, troop barracks, and equipment necessary to coordinate rebel operations across the galaxy. Shield generators protected the base from orbital bombardment, and the rebels established a network of defensive positions around the installation. Life on Hoth was challenging. Personnel adapted to the brutal cold, modified equipment to function in sub-zero temperatures, and learned to operate in an environment that could kill with exposure in minutes. The rebels used native creatures called tauntauns as mounts for patrol duty, as the animals were better adapted to Hoth's conditions than most technology. Luke Skywalker, now a commander in the Alliance and a pilot of considerable renown, was on patrol when one of Vader's probe droids landed in Hoth's wastes. Before he could investigate the crash site, he was attacked by a wampa, one of Hoth's predators. The creature dragged him to its cave, and Luke nearly died from his injuries and exposure before using the Force to escape and being rescued by Han Solo. The probe droid transmitted images of the rebel base before being destroyed. The data reached Vader's flagship, the Superstar Destroyer Executor, and the Dark Lord knew immediately that he'd found his target. Admiral Kendall Ozell, the fleet's commanding officer, was skeptical that the energy readings indicated anything more than a smuggler outpost.
Vader knew better.
He ordered Death Squadron, the Imperial fleet under his command, to the Hoth system immediately. Admiral Ozzel made a critical error. He brought the fleet out of hyperspace too close to Hoth, alerting the rebels to the Imperial presence. This incompetence allowed Echo Base to raise their planetary shields, preventing orbital bombardment and forcing the Empire to conduct a ground assault. Vader, in a display of the casual brutality that defined Imperial leadership, used the Force to kill Ozzel remotely, promoting Captain Firmus Piet to Admiral on the spot. The Alliance immediately began evacuation procedures. Transport ships were prepared to flee the system while the rebel military bought them time. The base's ion cannon could disable Star Destroyers temporarily, creating windows for transports to escape, but the evacuation would take time, and the Empire's ground forces were already deploying. General Maximilian Veers led the Imperial assault force. His army centered on all-terrain armored transports, massive four-legged walkers that stood over 20 meters tall. These AT-ATs were virtually impervious to small arms fire, each one carrying troops and heavy weapons. They advanced across Hoth's icy plains with mechanical precision, unstoppable behemoths that represented the Empire's overwhelming military might. The rebel defense was commanded by General Carlos Recon, who coordinated the evacuation while directing the military response. Trenches had been dug around Echo Base's perimeter, filled with rebel soldiers manning anti-vehicle cannons and other weapons. Snow speeders, T-47 airspeeders modified for Hoth's conditions, launched to engage the Imperial walkers.
The Battle of Hoth showcased the brutal efficiency of Imperial military doctrine.
The AT-ATs advanced in formation, their massive size allowing them to simply ignore most of the rebels' defensive fire. Anti-vehicle cannons proved ineffective against their armor. The snowspeeders discovered that their laser cannons couldn't penetrate the walkers' defenses. The Empire had brought overwhelming force to crush the rebellion's main base, and the rebels were outmatched. Luke Skywalker, leading Rogue Squadron in the snowspeeder attack, realized that conventional weapons wouldn't stop the AT-ATs.
In desperation, he ordered his pilots to use their tow cables to entangle the walker's legs.
It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver, requiring the speeders to fly in tight circles around the massive vehicles while avoiding defensive fire. But it worked. Wedge Antilles and his gunner succeeded in toppling one of the walkers, proving the technique viable. Despite this tactical success, the battle was clearly lost. The Imperial ground forces were too numerous, too well armed. The best the rebels could hope for was to delay the Empire long enough for the evacuation to complete. Soldiers fought from their trenches, buying time with their lives. The ion cannon disabled Star Destroyers in orbit, allowing transport ships to flee the system. Every minute the defense held meant more rebels escaped. General Veers, piloting an AT-AT personally, reached Echo Base's main power generator and destroyed it with the walker's heavy cannons. The shield collapsed, leaving the base vulnerable to orbital strike. But the evacuation was already well underway. The rebel transport ships had scattered to predetermined rendezvous points across the galaxy. The Alliance leadership had escaped. The military equipment that could be saved was aboard fleeing vessels. Darth Vader arrived at Echo Base shortly after Imperial forces secured it, but the rebels he sought were gone. The base was abandoned, stripped of anything valuable, just another empty facility. Vader's hunt for Luke Skywalker had failed, and the Alliance leadership had escaped to continue their rebellion. The Empire had won a tactical victory, destroying the rebel base and forcing the Alliance to scatter. But it was a hollow triumph. The Battle of Hoth represented both the Empire's strength and its fundamental weakness. Yes, Imperial forces could bring overwhelming military power against any target. The sheer scale of resources available to the Empire meant it could crush any conventional military opposition. But the rebellion didn't fight conventionally. It dispersed, regrouped, and continued fighting from new locations. The Empire could win every major battle and still lose the war. For the Rebel Alliance, Hoth was a devastating defeat. They'd lost their main base, tons of equipment, and numerous personnel. The evacuation had been successful, but it was still a retreat under fire, a scramble to survive rather than a planned relocation. The Alliance was scattered across the galaxy, its leadership separated, its cohesion tested. But the rebels survived, and survival was a form of victory. Despite the Empire knowing the location of Echo Base, despite having time to prepare a massive assault, despite bringing overwhelming force, the Imperial forces failed to capture or destroy the Alliance leadership. Mon Mothma, Admiral Akbar, and the other key figures who directed the rebellion lived to fight another day. Han Solo and Princess Leia fled Hoth aboard the Millennium Falcon, but the ship's hyperdrive was damaged, preventing them from jumping to light speed. They hid in an asteroid field, evaded pursuit through Han's exceptional piloting, and eventually sought refuge at Cloud City on the gas giant Bespin. Unknown to them, Darth Vader had a trap waiting. Luke, following the Force ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi's instructions, traveled to the swamp planet Dagobah to train under the Jedi Master Yoda. The ancient Jedi, who'd hidden on Dagobah since the fall of the Order, put Luke through rigorous training, teaching him to control and understand the Force. But Luke's training was cut short when he had a vision of his friends in danger, and despite Yoda's warnings, he rushed off to save them. The period following Hoth saw the rebellion operating more dispersed than ever. Individual cells conducted operations independently, coordinating through secure communications but lacking the central command structure that Echo Base had provided.
This actually made the Alliance harder to destroy.
There was no single base to attack, no concentration of forces to eliminate. The Empire could win battles but couldn't land a knockout blow. Darth Vader's personal hunt for Luke intensified. The Dark Lord had learned through the Force that this young pilot was actually his son, Anakin Skywalker's child, who'd survived despite Palpatine's assurances that Padme and her child had died. Vader saw an opportunity. If he could turn Luke to the dark side, they could overthrow the Emperor and rule the galaxy as father and son. This revelation added a personal dimension to Vader's pursuit. He wasn't just hunting a rebel pilot anymore. He was seeking his son, the last connection to his former life. When Vader lured Luke into a trap at Cloud City, his goal wasn't to kill him, but to recruit him. The duel between father and son ended with Vader cutting off Luke's hand and revealing the truth of Luke's parentage. Luke's rejection of Vader's offer, his willingness to die rather than join the dark side, planted seeds of doubt in the Dark Lord. For the first time in decades, Anakin Skywalker stirred beneath the machine armor. The Emperor's control over his apprentice, absolute for so long, began to show cracks. The Empire's position after Hoth appeared dominant. It had scattered the Rebel Alliance, continued to control the vast majority of the galaxy, and maintained overwhelming military superiority. But beneath this apparent strength, weaknesses were emerging. The Emperor's reliance on fear was creating resistance in systems that might otherwise have remained neutral. Vader's obsession with Luke distracted him from purely military objectives, and the Empire's very size made it bureaucratic, slow to adapt, vulnerable to the kind of hit-and-run tactics the rebellion employed. The rebels regrouped, consolidated their scattered forces, and continued the fight. The defeat at Hoth had tested them, but they hadn't broken. If anything, the Alliance emerged more resilient, having proven they could survive the Empire's best efforts to destroy them. The war continued, and the galaxy remained contested territory between tyranny and freedom. The second Death Star and the Emperor's trap, the destruction of the first Death Star, should have taught the Empire a lesson about over-reliance on superweapons. Emperor Palpatine drew a different conclusion. The problem wasn't the concept of a planet destroying battle station. The problem was that the first one had been destroyed before it could terrorize the galaxy into submission. The solution was obvious: build another one, bigger and more powerful, with the design flaws corrected. Construction began on the DS-2 Death Star II mobile battle station within a year of the first station's destruction. This new battle station would be even larger than its predecessor, measuring 200 kilometers in diameter. It would have multiple super lasers instead of one, allowing it to fire more frequently. The thermal exhaust port vulnerability that had doomed the first Death Star was eliminated entirely through redesign. The construction was conducted in the Endor system, in orbit around the forest moon of Endor. The Empire established a massive shield generator on the moon's surface, projecting an energy barrier that made the Death Star invulnerable while under construction. Imperial engineers and slave labor worked around the clock to complete the battle station. This time, there would be no mistakes. Palpatine conceived an even more ambitious plan than simply building a new superweapon. He would use the Death Star II as bait, drawing the entire Rebel Alliance into a trap where he could destroy them once and for all. The Emperor leaked intelligence to the rebellion through carefully maintained channels, allowing them to discover the Death Star's location and the fact that its weapon systems were not yet operational. The intelligence was designed to be irresistible. A Death Star under construction, protected only by a shield generator, with the Emperor himself aboard overseeing its completion.
If the rebellion destroyed the battle station and killed Palpatine, the war would essentially be over.
The Alliance couldn't ignore such an opportunity. They would have to commit their entire military force to the assault. What the rebels didn't know was that the Death Star II's superlaser was fully operational. Palpatine planned to ambush the Alliance fleet with both the battle station's firepower and a massive Imperial armada hidden on the far side of Endor. The shield generator would be defended by an entire legion of the Emperor's best troops.
When the rebels arrived, they would find themselves caught in a trap from which there could be no escape.
Bothan spies, working for the Alliance, acquired the leaked intelligence at tremendous cost. Many Bothans died delivering this information, a sacrifice that made the intelligence seem even more credible. When the data reached Alliance Command, they analyzed it extensively and concluded they had to act. A Death Star, even incomplete, was too dangerous to ignore. And the opportunity to strike a decapitating blow against the Empire by killing the Emperor was worth any risk. Mon Mothma presented the plan to the assembled Alliance leadership and military commanders. A strike team would land on Endor's forest moon to destroy the shield generator. Once the shield was down, the Alliance fleet would assault the Death Star itself, sending starfighters into the incomplete superstructure to destroy its reactor before the station became operational. Han Solo, now a general despite his protests, Princess Leia insisted on joining the mission, as did Chewbacca, Luke Skywalker, and others. The team would use a captured Imperial shuttle to bypass Imperial security and land on the moon, presenting themselves as part of the construction effort. Luke knew the mission was more complicated than it appeared. His connection to the Force told him that Darth Vader was in the Endor system, and he knew his presence would betray the strike team's location. More troubling, Luke believed there was still good in his father, that Anakin Skywalker could be redeemed. He decided to confront Vader directly, to attempt to turn him back to the light side even as the battle raged around them. The strike team landed on Endor and immediately encountered complications. The forest moon was inhabited by Ewoks, a primitive species of small furred beings who initially captured the rebels. Through a combination of C-3PO's translation abilities and demonstrations of technology the Ewoks interpreted as magic, the rebels convinced the natives to help them. The Ewoks proved crucial allies. They knew the forest intimately, understood the Empire's patrol patterns, and possessed a surprising martial capability despite their primitive weapons. When the strike team was captured by Imperial forces waiting for them, exactly as Palpatine had foreseen, the Ewoks mounted a rescue operation that caught the Empire completely off guard. Luke surrendered himself to Vader, hoping to convince his father to abandon the dark side. Vader took him to the Emperor aboard the Death Star, and Palpatine revealed the full extent of his trap. The shield generator's capture was anticipated. The Alliance fleet was walking into an ambush. Everything was proceeding as he had foreseen. Admiral Akbar led the rebel fleet out of hyperspace at the predetermined coordinates and immediately recognized they'd been deceived.
The Death Star's weapons were operational, and a massive Imperial fleet waited in ambush.
The rebels found themselves caught between the battle station, which began firing its super laser and destroying rebel capital ships with single shots, and the Imperial Navy, which moved to prevent their escape. On Endor, Han's team fought to reach the shield generator bunker, despite stiff Imperial resistance. The Ewoks joined the battle, using primitive weapons with surprising effectiveness. Log traps crushed AT-ST walkers, stone projectiles brought down Imperial troops, and guerrilla tactics disrupted the Empire's defensive coordination. What should have been an easy Imperial victory became a chaotic melee. Aboard the Death Star, Palpatine orchestrated events with malicious glee. He forced Luke to watch the destruction of the rebel fleet, taunting him with his powerlessness. He goaded Luke to strike at him in anger, knowing that such an act would lead to Luke's fall to the dark side. Vader stood between them, waiting for his son to make the choice between light and darkness. Luke resisted as long as he could, but watching his friends die while the Emperor mocked him became too much. He attacked Palpatine, but Vader intercepted, engaging his son in a lightsaber duel. The Emperor watched, pleased that his plan was working perfectly. One way or another, he would win. Either Luke would fall to the dark side, or Vader would kill him, and the last hope of the Jedi would die.
The space battle raged with desperate intensity.
Admiral Akbar ordered the fleet to engage the Imperial Star Destroyers at point-blank range, negating the Death Star's ability to fire on them without hitting its own ships. Lando Calrissian, commanding the Millennium Falcon, led Gold Squadron and Green Squadron in attacks on Imperial capital ships, while waiting for word that the shield generator had been destroyed. On Endor's surface, Han and the strike team finally penetrated the bunker's defenses. Charges were set, the shield generator was destroyed, and the barrier protecting the Death Star collapsed. The way was open for the Alliance's final assault on the battle station's reactor. Luke and Vader's duel reached its climax. Luke, tapping into his anger and pain, overpowered his father and severed Vader's mechanical hand. The Emperor urged him to finish Vader and take his place as Palpatine's apprentice. But Luke, seeing his own hand artificial from their previous duel, realized he was on the path to becoming exactly what Vader was. He threw down his lightsaber and declared himself a Jedi, as his father had been before him. Palpatine, enraged at being denied his new apprentice, unleashed Force lightning on Luke. The electrical energy, pure dark side power, tore through Luke's body with agonizing intensity. As Palpatine tortured the young Jedi, Anakin Skywalker finally awoke within Darth Vader's shell. The man who'd been corrupted by promises of saving those he loved couldn't watch his son die. In the defining moment of his life, Anakin Skywalker betrayed his master. He grabbed Palpatine and hurled him into the Death Star's reactor shaft. The Emperor's Force lightning struck Vader as he did so, destroying the life support systems that kept the former Jedi alive. Palpatine fell screaming into the depths, his body consumed by energy, and for the first time in over 40 years, the galaxy was free of the Sith Lord who'd corrupted it. Lando and Wedge Antilles piloted their fighters into the Death Star superstructure as the station began tearing itself apart. They reached the reactor and fired, triggering the chain reaction that would destroy the battle station. Racing against the expanding explosion, they barely escaped before the Death Star 2 erupted in a blast that could be seen from Endor's surface.
Anakin Skywalker asked his son to remove his mask, wanting to see Luke with his own eyes before dying.
In those final moments, redeemed by his choice, Anakin became one with the Force. Luke escaped the battle station with his father's body, just before it was destroyed. The Battle of Endor was a complete victory for the Rebel Alliance, The Emperor was dead, Darth Vader was dead, the Death Star 2 was destroyed, and the Imperial fleet was shattered. The spine of Imperial military power was broken. What had seemed like certain defeat for the rebellion became the greatest victory in their history. Across the galaxy, celebrations erupted as word spread that the Empire had fallen. The Rebel Alliance could begin the process of transforming into the new Republic, of rebuilding the democracy that Palpatine had destroyed. The 24-year reign of the Galactic Empire appeared to be over, but the Empire had been too large, too entrenched to simply vanish overnight. The Emperor's death didn't eliminate the military infrastructure he'd built, or convert Imperial loyalists to the Republic's cause. The battle had been won, but the war for the galaxy's future was only beginning its next phase. The Emperor's death aboard the second Death Star sent shockwaves through the Galactic Empire. For the first time in nearly 25 years, the absolute authority that had defined Imperial governance was gone. Palpatine had centralized power so completely that no obvious successor existed. The hierarchical structure he'd created, designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating enough power to challenge him, now meant the Empire had no clear leadership. But Palpatine, always the long-term strategist, had anticipated the possibility of defeat. The Emperor didn't fear death itself. He feared that the Empire might continue without him, that his carefully constructed regime might simply replace him and carry on. To Palpatine, if the Empire failed to protect its Emperor, then that Empire deserved to be destroyed. Within weeks of the Battle of Endor, red-robed Sentinel messenger droids began appearing throughout Imperial space. These automated couriers had been programmed years earlier, waiting for a specific signal that would only transmit upon the Emperor's death. When Palpatine died, the droids activated and delivered posthumous orders to carefully selected Imperial officers. The orders were brutal in their simplicity. Operation Cinder was to commence immediately. Designated planets across the galaxy, both loyal Imperial worlds and those in rebellion, would be subjected to orbital bombardment using climate disruption arrays and other devastating weapons. The stated purpose was to punish the Empire for failing to prevent the Emperor's death, to eliminate any weakness, and to ensure that only the strongest Imperial elements survived to rebuild. Admiral Garrick Versio received his orders while in orbit above Vardos, a world renowned for its loyalty to the Empire. Vardos had been a model Imperial system, its population fanatically devoted to the Emperor's vision. The idea of destroying such a world seemed insane, but the Emperor's final command was absolute. Climate disruption satellites were deployed, and within hours, catastrophic weather patterns began tearing Vardos apart. Eden Versio, daughter of Admiral Versio and commander of the elite Inferno Squad, witnessed the destruction of her home world and questioned everything she'd believed about the Empire. She'd served loyally, conducting black operations in the Empire's name, believing she fought for order and security. Operation Cinder revealed the truth. The Emperor saw his subjects as tools to be discarded when they no longer served his purposes. The planet Naboo, Palpatine's own homeworld, was also targeted for destruction. The Emperor's contempt for sentiment extended even to the world of his birth. When Operation Cinder struck Naboo, Princess Leia Organa led New Republic forces in defense of the peaceful planet. The Battle of Theed saw Republic soldiers and Naboo security forces fighting to disable the climate disruption arrays before they could complete their work. Lua's forces succeeded in saving Naboo, but many of the worlds weren't as fortunate. Burnham Khan, Kandavant, Abednego, Kamanor, and Necronus suffered devastating attacks. Millions died as entire planets were rendered uninhabitable. The operation achieved exactly what Palpatine intended. It sowed chaos eliminated Imperial resources that might fall into Republic hands, and punished the galaxy for his defeat. But Operation Cinder also backfired in ways the Emperor couldn't have foreseen from beyond death. Many Imperial officers and soldiers, witnessing the brutal targeting of loyal worlds, defected to the New Republic. Eden Versio and her second-in-command, Del Mico, abandoned the Empire entirely, bringing valuable intelligence and skills to the Republic's side. Each Operation Cinder attack created new enemies for the Empire and new allies for the Republic. The operation was supposed to be the first phase of a larger contingency plan. Counselor Gallius Rax, a mysterious Imperial officer who claimed to be executing the Emperor's posthumous wishes, began gathering the remnants of the Imperial military. Rax had been trained by Palpatine himself, groomed for this specific moment, and he had access to the Emperor's secret plans for the Empire's future. Grand Admiral Ray Sloan, one of the Empire's most capable commanders, initially worked with Rax to maintain Imperial cohesion. She believed they were preserving the Empire, reorganizing it under new leadership, and preparing for a renewed campaign against the Republic. What she didn't fully understand was that Rax's orders from the dead Emperor went far beyond simple military reorganization. Palpatine's contingency plan was based on a fundamental belief: if the Empire couldn't protect him, it didn't deserve to exist, the regime should be destroyed, its weak elements purged, and a new empire should rise in the unknown regions of space, far from the New Republic's reach. Only the strongest, most loyal Imperial officers and personnel would be selected for this new beginning.
Operation Cinder was the punishment.
The next phase would be the purge, and the final phase would be the exodus of chosen Imperials into the unknown regions, where they would rebuild the Empire according to Palpatine's vision, waiting for the day when they could return and reclaim the galaxy. The New Republic, meanwhile, struggled to establish itself. Mon Mothma was elected Chancellor, and the Galactic Senate reconvened on Chandrila. Systems across the galaxy sent representatives eager to participate in the restored democracy. But the Republic faced enormous challenges. Entire regions remained under Imperial control. War criminals needed to be prosecuted. Economic systems, disrupted by decades of Imperial rule, required reconstruction. The Empire had lasted only 24 years, but in that time it had transformed galactic society fundamentally. Entire generations had grown up knowing only Imperial rule. Government structures were designed to serve autocracy. Military forces were accustomed to authoritarian command. Transitioning from dictatorship back to democracy proved far more complicated than simply declaring the Republic restored. Military operations continued as the New Republic sought to eliminate the remaining Imperial threat. Republic forces liberated worlds still under occupation, pursued Imperial war criminals, and tried to prevent the scattered Imperial remnants from consolidating. But the Republic was, by its nature, a democratic institution that required consensus and deliberation.
The Empire's remnants could act decisively because they remained essentially military dictatorships.
Several significant Imperial remnants emerged in the power vacuum following Endor. Grand Moff Ubric Adelhard established an iron blockade around the Anoat sector, cutting it off from the rest of the galaxy and refusing to acknowledge the Emperor's death. He maintained control through information suppression, telling the sector's inhabitants that the reports of Palpatine's demise were rebel propaganda. Grand Moff Lozen Tolruk seized control of Kashyyyk and its Wookiee population, using the captive aliens as slave labor. Other moves and governors claimed their territories as independent fiefdoms, maintaining Imperial rule in miniature while fighting both the Republic and rival Imperial remnants. Gallius Rax worked to unify these scattered elements, positioning himself as the Empire's de facto leader while operating through puppet authorities. He established what he called the Shadow Council, a group of high-ranking Imperial officers who would coordinate the Empire's military operations. But Rax's true agenda remained hidden even from his supposed allies. The Emperor had established secret facilities in the unknown regions years before his death. These included the Eclipse, his personal superstar destroyer, and extensive military stockpiles positioned for exactly this contingency. Rax's goal was to winnow the Imperial military down to its strongest elements, then lead those survivors into the unknown regions where they would form the foundation of a new empire.
Grand Admiral Sloane gradually uncovered the full extent of Rax's plans and the Emperor's contingency.
She realized that Operation Cinder wasn't about punishing weakness. It was about deliberately destroying the Empire to create the conditions for its rebirth. The Emperor had never intended for the existing Imperial regime to survive his death. He wanted it replaced with something new, something stronger, built from the tested survivors of the Galactic Civil War. The Republic made overtures to Imperial holdouts, offering conditional pardons and amnesty for those willing to surrender. Grand Vizier Masameda, technically the highest-ranking Imperial official still alive after the Emperor's death, found himself powerless in Coruscant, essentially under house arrest as the capital descended into chaos. The empire he'd helped build was tearing itself apart, and he lacked the authority or resources to stop it.
As Operation Cinder ran its course and the surviving Imperial forces regrouped, both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be the final major engagement of the Galactic Civil War.
The New Republic wanted to end the conflict decisively, to eliminate the Imperial military as a coherent fighting force. The Empire needed a last stand that would allow its chosen survivors to escape while the rest fought and died. The stage was being set for the Battle of Jakku, where the Empire would make its final stand and Palpatine's contingency would reach its terrible conclusion. But before that final battle could take place, the scattered remnants of the Empire had to be consolidated, and the New Republic had to hunt down the last concentrations of Imperial military power. The splintering empire, a fractured regime. In the year following the Battle of Endor, the Galactic Empire existed only in fragments. What had once been a unified authoritarian state stretching across most of the known galaxy had shattered into competing remnants, each claiming legitimacy while fighting for survival. The power vacuum left by Palpatine's death created chaos throughout Imperial space, and that chaos was exactly what the Emperor had intended. The Imperial Security Bureau, which had operated as the Empire's primary intelligence and surveillance organization, found its officers scattered across various remnants. Some ISB directors went into hiding, others joined the New Republic to avoid prosecution, and a few attempted to maintain their operations under new Imperial masters. ISB Director Sliro Barsha heavily criticized the Empire's performance at Hoth, viewing the brutal military assault as wasteful when infiltration and intelligence work could have achieved better results. The fracturing of Imperial authority created opportunities for ambitious officers to carve out their own territories. Without the Emperor's absolute authority to enforce unity, the competition that Palpatine had encouraged among his subordinates became outright civil conflict. Imperial governors who'd reported directly to the Emperor now claimed independence, defending their sectors against both Republican forces and rival Imperials. The core worlds, which had been the heart of Imperial power, descended into a particularly bitter struggle. Coruscant, the galactic capital, became a battleground between competing factions. The New Republic wanted to claim the symbolic and strategic victory of capturing the capital. Various Imperial remnants sought to maintain control. Criminal syndicates saw opportunity in the chaos. The ancient planet that had stood for over 1,000 years as the center of galactic government became a war zone. Grand Admiral Ray Sloan attempted to maintain some semblance of unified Imperial command, but her authority was contested by multiple rivals. Fleet admirals commanded their vessels as personal fiefdoms. Army commanders held planets through military force. Moffs and governors operated as independent warlords. The centralized command structure that had defined the Empire was gone, replaced by a chaotic network of temporary alliances and constant betrayals. The Imperial military, which numbered in the billions at its height, began hemorrhaging personnel. Soldiers who'd believed they served a cause greater than themselves discovered their empire was fragmenting into warlord territories. Officers who'd joined the Imperial Navy for security and advancement found themselves stranded on dying star destroyers with no clear chain of command. Defections to the New Republic increased daily. But some Imperials remained fanatically loyal, not to individual commanders, but to the idea of the Empire itself. They'd spent their entire adult lives in service to Palpatine's regime. They believed in the order the Empire had provided, the security it promised, and the vision of galactic dominance it represented. For these true believers, surrender was unthinkable. They would fight to the last rather than accept the restoration of the Republic. The New Republic faced the challenge of governing an expanding territory while simultaneously conducting military operations against Imperial remnants. Chancellor Mon Mothma walked a careful political line, needing to appear strong enough to protect the Republic's member systems while not becoming so militaristic that the Republic resembled the Empire it had replaced. The Galactic Senate, reconvened after decades of irrelevance, struggled with its renewed responsibilities. Senators who'd served under the Republic, survived the Empire, and now participated in the New Republic brought complicated loyalties and old grudges. Some advocated for total military victory over all Imperial remnants. Others pushed for reconciliation and integration of former Imperial systems. Still others focused on reconstruction and addressing the tremendous economic damage caused by years of war. Princess Leia Organa, now a senator representing the destroyed world of Alderaan, became one of the Republic's most influential voices. Her role in the rebellion's victories gave her credibility, while her tragic loss of her homeworld to the Empire's cruelty symbolized what was at stake. She advocated for a strong military response to Imperial remnants while supporting reconstruction efforts in liberated systems. Luke Skywalker, the last Jedi Knight, began considering how to rebuild the Jedi Order. The ancient order had been corrupted and destroyed because it had grown too attached to political power, too confident in its own wisdom. Luke wanted to learn from those failures, to create something new that honored the Jedi's legacy while avoiding their mistakes. He began searching for ancient Jedi texts and artifacts, gathering knowledge that had been scattered or destroyed during the Empire's purge. The Empire's industrial infrastructure, built to support endless military production, began converting to civilian purposes as systems joined the Republic.
Shipyards that had produced Star Destroyers were retooled to build merchant vessels and civilian transports.
Weapons factories became manufacturing plants for peacetime goods. The transition was slow and often incomplete, as many facilities had been so specialized for military production that converting them proved impractical. Slavery, which the Empire had reintroduced after the Republic's abolition laws, became a major point of contention.
The New Republic immediately outlawed slavery, but enforcement proved difficult.
Entire economies in former Imperial territory depended on slave labor.
Criminal syndicates had established massive slaving operations.
Liberation meant freedom for millions, but also economic disruption that left some systems in chaos. The Wookiees of Kashyyyk, enslaved en masse by the Empire to build the Death Star and other projects, were among the first liberated populations. Han Solo personally led missions to free Wookiee labor camps, fulfilling a life debt to Chewbacca by helping liberate his people. These operations became templates for similar liberations across the galaxy, though the scale of Imperial slavery meant full emancipation would take years. Gallius Rax, meanwhile, continued executing the Emperor's contingency plan. He gathered the largest concentration of Imperial military forces around himself, positioning them for the coming confrontation.
But Rax also began selecting which personnel would be allowed to join him in the unknown regions.
His criteria were brutal. Only those who demonstrated absolute loyalty, exceptional competence, and willingness to sacrifice everything for the Empire's future would be chosen. Among those selected was Commandant Brandal Hux, an officer who'd established training programs for indoctrinating children into Imperial service. Hux's methods were controversial, even among Imperials, involving the recruitment and conditioning of orphans and vulnerable youth to create absolutely loyal soldiers. Rax saw the value in Hux's expertise for building the new empire in the unknown regions. The Grand Vizier Maz Ameda, nominally the highest-ranking Imperial official, found himself increasingly marginalized. Without military forces under his direct command, without the Emperor's authority to enforce his will, Ameda was a figurehead. He controlled Coruscant's Imperial palace, but little else. The New Republic contacted him about conditional surrender, and Ameda realized he had no better options. The empire he'd helped create was dying, and his choices were to surrender with dignity or be swept aside by the forces destroying it. As the first anniversary of the Battle of Endor approached, the Galactic Civil War appeared to be winding down. Imperial remnants held scattered territories, but they were isolated and besieged. The New Republic controlled the core worlds and was expanding into the Mid-Rim and Outer Rim territories. Public sentiment had turned decisively against the Empire. Victory for the Republic seemed inevitable, but Gallius Rax was assembling the largest remaining Imperial military force for one final battle. He sent orders to Imperial commanders across the galaxy, "Bring your forces to Jakku, a remote desert world in the western reaches." The Empire would make its last stand there, and in that battle, Rax would implement the final phase of Palpatine's contingency. The weak would be destroyed, the strong would survive to rebuild, and the galaxy would learn that the Empire's fall was not the end, but merely a transition to something new. The Battle of Jakku, the Empire's last stand Jakku, was an unremarkable world on the edge of the known galaxy. A desert planet with minimal strategic value, it had little to recommend it beyond its remoteness. The Empire maintained a small presence there, including a research facility known as the Jakku Observatory, but the world was far from Imperial population centers or major military installations. It seemed an unlikely place for the Empire's final battle, but Jakku had been chosen by Emperor Palpatine himself years before his death. The planet harbored ancient Sith artifacts and served as a repository for dark side knowledge. More importantly, it was geographically positioned between the known galaxy and the unknown regions, making it ideal as both a final battlefield and a launching point for the contingency's next phase. Gallius Rax summoned the remaining Imperial forces to Jakku approximately 1 year after the Battle of Endor. Star destroyers from across the dying empire converged on the desert world, bringing with them hundreds of thousands of personnel and the last substantial Imperial military stockpiles. The New Republic's intelligence network detected this concentration of forces, and Chancellor Mon Mothma recognized the opportunity for what it was, a chance to end the war decisively. The New Republic assembled its own armada. Admiral Akbar commanded the fleet, while ground forces prepared for what would be the largest planetary assault since Hoth. Every available ship was diverted to Jakku. This would be the battle that decided the war's outcome once and for all. If the Republic won, the Empire would be finished. If the Empire somehow achieved victory, the war could drag on for years. Rax positioned his forces carefully. The Imperial Navy orbited Jakku in defensive formations designed to maximize their firing arcs while preventing the New Republic from achieving orbital superiority. Ground forces established positions across Jakku's deserts, preparing defensive lines around key installations. The Ravager, a superstar destroyer that served as Rax's flagship, commanded the center of the Imperial fleet. What neither the rank-and-file Imperial personnel nor the New Republic forces knew was that Rax had no intention of winning this battle in any conventional sense. The Emperor's contingency plan called for the Empire's destruction, and Jakku would be the instrument of that destruction. Rax had rigged the planet itself to explode, using ancient Sith artifacts to corrupt Jakku's core with dark side energy. When the battle reached its peak, when both Imperial and Republic forces were fully committed, he would detonate the planet, destroying both fleets and crippling both governments. The survivors of this cataclysm carefully selected Imperial personnel who would be safely away when the explosion occurred, would then flee to the unknown regions. There they would join the forces already assembled aboard the Eclipse and begin building Palpatine's new empire, one purged of weakness and tested through the crucible of Jakku's destruction. Grand Admiral Sloane, who'd been working with Rax throughout the post-Endor period, finally understood the full scope of his plans. She confronted him in the Jakku Observatory as the battle raged above. Rax admitted everything. The contingency was never about preserving the existing empire. It was about destroying it to create something new. Palpatine had always intended for his regime to die with him, to be replaced by a stronger successor forged from the survivors. Sloane killed Rax, shooting him before he could complete the detonation sequence. The dying counselor urged her to flee, to take his place as the leader of the contingency, to guide the selected Imperials into the unknown regions as planned. Sloane, pragmatic to the end, recognized that the Empire in the known galaxy was finished. The Battle of Jakku raged for over a day. In space, capital ships traded broadsides while starfighters engaged in swirling dogfights. New Republic cruisers targeted Imperial star destroyers, overwhelming them through coordinated fire. X-Wings and A-Wings struck at TIE fighters that swarmed from Imperial carriers. The Ravager, massive and deadly, became the focal point of the space battle as New Republic forces concentrated fire on Rax's flagship. On Jakku's surface, ground forces clashed across the desert wastes. New Republic troops, supported by artillery and air cover, assaulted Imperial defensive positions. Stormtroopers fought from entrenched positions, their white armor stark against Jakku's yellow sand. AT-ATs waded through the desert, engaging Republic armor and infantry.
The scale of the battle was staggering, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers fighting across multiple theaters simultaneously.
The Ravager, badly damaged and listing, began descending into Jakku's atmosphere. Unable to maintain orbit, the massive vessel crashed into the desert, leaving a debris field kilometers wide. Thousands of Imperial personnel died in the crash, and the ship's reactor threatened to go critical. But even crippled and crashed, the Ravager remained dangerous, its weapons still firing at Republic targets. As the battle progressed, Imperial morale collapsed. Communication from Gallius Rax had ceased. The promised reinforcements never arrived. Imperial commanders realized they'd been brought to Jakku to die in a battle they couldn't win. Some units continued fighting out of loyalty or desperation, others began surrendering en masse. A few attempted to flee the system, only to be intercepted by New Republic forces. Sloane escaped Jakku with Brendol Hux, his young son Armitage, and a group of child soldiers Hux had trained. They boarded the Imperialis, the Emperor's personal yacht, and fled to the unknown regions where the Eclipse waited. There, Sloane would take command of the Imperial remnant that had escaped the known galaxy, beginning the long process of rebuilding in secret. The New Republic achieved complete victory at Jakku. The largest remaining Imperial military force was destroyed or captured. Hundreds of Star Destroyers were disabled or eliminated. The Imperial ground forces were routed. Those personnel who survived the battle and weren't selected for Sloane's exodus faced capture and potential prosecution as war criminals. In the aftermath, Grand Vizier Masameta formally surrendered on behalf of the Galactic Empire. He traveled to Chandrila to sign the Galactic Concordance, the treaty that officially ended the Galactic Civil War. The terms were harsh but not vindictive. Imperial military forces would demobilize, war criminals would face justice, and all worlds under Imperial control would be invited to join the New Republic. The Empire's remnants were ordered to cease fighting immediately. Most complied, exhausted from a war they'd lost, but some Imperial holdouts on Jakku refused to surrender even after the Concordance was signed. Fighting continued on the desert world for several months as die-hard Imperials were gradually hunted down or killed. The sands of Jakku became a graveyard for the Empire's military, littered with crashed ships and the ruins of the regime's last army. The New Republic estimated casualties on both sides, counting the dead and missing from the battle and its aftermath. Tens of thousands had died in space and on the ground. The exact number was impossible to determine, as many bodies were buried in Jakku's desert or vaporized in ship explosions. The battle had achieved its strategic objective, ending the war, but the cost had been staggering. Jakku itself was left devastated. The crashed ships, including the Ravager and numerous Star Destroyers, became landmarks in the desert. Scavengers descended on the planet, stripping the wrecks for salvageable parts and technology. What had been a battlefield became a junkyard, and what had been a junkyard became a home for those desperate or displaced enough to make their lives picking through the Empire's remains. The signing of the Galactic Concordance marked the official end of the Galactic Empire. 5 years after Palpatine's death, 29 years after the Emperor's rise to power, the regime that had dominated the galaxy through fear and military might was finished. The New Republic controlled the vast majority of inhabited systems. Democratic governance was restored. The age of empire was over. But in the unknown regions, Grand Admiral Rey Sloane and her followers were beginning their work. They had the Eclipse, the Emperor's resources, and Palpatine's final instructions. They would build a new empire, one tested through defeat and forged in the darkness beyond the galaxy's edge. The Galactic Empire was dead, but its legacy would endure in the First Order, waiting for the day when it could return and reclaim what had been lost. Legacy and the seeds of the First Order, the New Republic era, began with hope and optimism, but was shadowed by the unfinished business of the Empire's defeat. While the major Imperial military forces had been destroyed at Jakku, scattered remnants remained throughout the galaxy. Moff Gideon maintained a hidden base on Mandalore. Other Imperial warlords held minor territories in the Outer Rim. These remnants were too small to threaten the Republic militarily, but represented ongoing security challenges. The Republic demilitarized rapidly after the war's end. Senators who had spent their entire lives fighting against militarism argued that maintaining a large standing military would replicate the Empire's authoritarian structures. The New Republic Navy was reduced to a small defensive force. Standing armies were demobilized. Systems were encouraged to maintain local defense forces, but discouraged from building regional militaries that might threaten neighbors. This idealistic approach created vulnerabilities. Criminal syndicates expanded into power vacuums left by Imperial withdrawal. Former Imperial officers formed mercenary companies or became pirates. And in the unknown regions, the First Order was building strength without detection or interference from a republic that believed the threat was past. The First Order's development occurred in absolute secrecy over approximately 2 decades. Grand Admiral Sloan led the initial reorganization, implementing Palpatine's instructions for creating an empire purged of weakness. She established strict hierarchies, brutal training regimens, and an ideological indoctrination program designed to create a new generation of Imperial loyalists who'd never known the Galactic Empire but were completely committed to its restoration. Brendal Hux, and later his son Armitage, developed the First Order Stormtrooper program.
Unlike the Empire's recruited soldiers, the First Order's troops were taken as children and conditioned from birth.
They were designated by serial numbers rather than names, stripped of individual identity, and trained to absolute obedience. The result was a military force more fanatical and dedicated than even the Empire had achieved. The First Order also benefited from the Emperor's foresight in stockpiling resources in the unknown regions. Automated shipyards, constructed vessels, using designs improved from Imperial models. The Resurgent-class Star Destroyer, the First Order's capital ship, was larger and more powerful than the Empire's Imperial-class vessels. Super Star Destroyers like the Supremacy dwarfed anything the Galactic Empire had deployed. Most critically, the First Order developed superweapon technology that surpassed even the Death Stars. Starkiller Base, constructed within a planet in the unknown regions, could drain stars of their energy and use that power to destroy entire star systems from across the galaxy. It represented Palpatine's doctrine of rule through fear taken to its logical extreme. Supreme Leader Snoke emerged as the First Order's public face, though his true nature remained mysterious. A being powerful in the dark side but not claiming the title of Sith, Snoke directed the First Order's operations while carefully building its military strength. Unknown to anyone in the First Order, Snoke was actually a creation of Emperor Palpatine, a puppet through which the deceased Emperor continued to influence galactic events. On the planet Exegol, hidden deep in the unknown regions, Palpatine had survived his apparent death at Endor. Through Sith sorcery and cloning technology, his consciousness had transferred to a clone body. Though this form was imperfect and degrading, it maintained his mind and his connection to the dark side. From Exegol, Palpatine orchestrated the First Order's development through Snoke, preparing for his ultimate return to power. The Sith Eternal, a cult of dark side loyalists on Exegol, worked on Project Necromancer, attempting to create a perfect clone vessel that could contain Palpatine's full power indefinitely. They built the Final Order, a fleet of Star Destroyers, each equipped with planet-destroying weapons. Thousands of these vessels were constructed in secret, representing a military force that could overwhelm the entire galaxy once unleashed. Meanwhile, the New Republic descended into political dysfunction. The Senate fragmented into factions with competing visions for the galaxy's future. The centrist faction, composed largely of former Imperial systems and sympathizers, advocated for strong centralized leadership and increased military spending. The populist faction, representing systems that had fought against the Empire, pushed for greater individual system autonomy and minimal military forces. This political gridlock prevented the Republic from addressing mounting threats. When reports emerged of unusual military activity in the unknown regions, the Senate deadlocked on whether to investigate. When intelligence suggested the First Order's existence, centrist senators dismissed it as fear-mongering designed to justify military expansion. Princess Leia, now General Organa, became increasingly frustrated with the Senate's inaction. She discovered evidence of the First Order's existence and their connection to Imperial remnants, but the Senate refused to take the threat seriously.
When her connection to Darth Vader became public, revealed by political rivals, her credibility in the Senate was destroyed.
She was forced to resign in disgrace, despite her decades of service to the Republic. Unwilling to abandon the fight against the Empire's successor, Leia formed the Resistance. This private military force, funded by sympathetic systems and wealthy supporters, operated independently of the Republic to monitor and counter First Order activities. The Resistance was small, under-resourced, and technically illegal under Republic law, but it represented the only organized opposition to the growing First Order threat. The First Order emerged into the open in 28 ABY with the Napkin Bombing, a terrorist attack that introduced the galaxy to their existence. Over the following years, they gradually infiltrated Republic politics, built support among centrist senators, and prepared for their conquest of the galaxy. By 34 ABY, they were ready to make their move. The destruction of the Hosnian system, where the new Republic Senate was meeting, eliminated the galactic government in a single blow. Starkiller Base, the First Order's superweapon, fired across the galaxy and vaporized 5 planets simultaneously, killing billions and decapitating the new Republic's leadership. With the Republic's military demobilized and its government destroyed, the First Order launched a full-scale invasion. The sequel trilogy chronicles the conflict between the First Order and the Resistance, the emergence of Rey as a new Jedi, and the revelation of Palpatine's survival. The First Order, despite achieving initial success, was ultimately defeated when Rey destroyed the resurrected Emperor on Exegol, and a citizen fleet rose up to destroy the Final Order's Star Destroyers. The pattern established by the Galactic Empire repeated itself in the First Order, an authoritarian regime built on fear and military might, achieved initial success through overwhelming force, only to be defeated by a smaller but more committed resistance. The cycle of tyranny rising and being defeated by heroes fighting for freedom played out again, echoing the events of the Galactic Civil War decades earlier. Conclusion: the Empire's enduring shadow.
The Galactic Empire's reign lasted only 24 years, from 19 BBY.
In the grand sweep of galactic history, this was a brief period, shorter than many individual lifetimes. Yet the Empire's impact on the galaxy was profound and long-lasting. It transformed societies, created generations who knew only authoritarian rule, and left scars that took decades to heal. The Empire represented what happens when democracy fails to defend itself, when fear is allowed to triumph over freedom, when people trade liberty for the promise of security. Palpatine didn't conquer the Republic through invasion. He dismantled it through its own institutions, using emergency powers and manufactured crises to accumulate absolute authority with the Senate's approval. The transition from Republic to Empire was legal, constitutional, and conducted with thunderous applause. This lesson about the fragility of democracy shaped the galaxy that emerged after the Empire's fall. The new Republic struggled to find the balance between maintaining security and preserving freedom. Too much military power risked recreating the authoritarianism they'd fought to defeat. Too little left them vulnerable to the very threats that ultimately destroyed them in the form of the First Order. The Empire's military legacy endured in the designs and doctrines that survived its collapse. Star Destroyer architecture influenced capital ship development for decades. Stormtrooper training methods were adapted by various militaries. The concept of ruling through fear, through devastating superweapons that terrorize populations into submission, was replicated by the First Order's Starkiller base and the Final Order's fleet. More insidiously, the Empire's ideology persisted. The speciesism, the authoritarianism, the belief that strength justified domination all found adherents in the post-Imperial galaxy. The First Order attracted recruits who'd grown up hearing stories of the Empire's order and stability, who'd been taught that democracy led to chaos and only strong leadership could maintain peace. The Sith, who'd orchestrated the Empire's rise and ruled through Palpatine and Vader, were ultimately destroyed. Rey's defeat of Palpatine at Exegol ended the Sith lineage that had survived for millennia. The cycle of Sith Lords training apprentices, of the dark side corrupting those who sought its power, was broken. Balance came to the Force, though the cost in lives and suffering was almost incomprehensible. The heroes who defeated the Empire became legends. Luke Skywalker, who'd believed in his father's redemption when no one else did, and whose faith helped bring Anakin back to the light. Leia Organa, who lost everything to the Empire, yet continued fighting for freedom until her last breath.
Han Solo, the smuggler who became a general and proved that anyone could be a hero.
They represented the best of what the galaxy could be when people refused to accept tyranny. The ordinary people who resisted the Empire, whose names weren't recorded in history but whose actions mattered just as much, deserve remembrance too. The rebels who died at Scarif stealing the Death Star plans. The pilots who flew into certain death at Yavin and Endor. The resistance fighters on countless worlds who sabotaged Imperial operations, sheltered fugitives, and kept hope alive in the darkest times. The Empire fell because enough people refused to accept its authority, because they believed freedom was worth fighting for despite the odds. Every small act of resistance, every refusal to comply with unjust orders, every individual who chose conscience over obedience contributed to the Empire's ultimate defeat. Tyranny requires compliance to function, and the galaxy eventually refused to comply. The story of the Empire's reign is a warning about how quickly democracy can be lost and how difficult it is to restore once destroyed. But it's also a story of hope, demonstrating that even the most powerful tyranny can be defeated by ordinary people committed to doing what's right. The Empire seemed invincible until it wasn't. Evil appeared triumphant until good found a way to prevail. As you drift off to sleep, consider the lessons of the Empire's rise and fall. Remember that freedom requires constant vigilance, that authoritarianism cloaks itself in promises of security, and that one person's choice to resist can inspire others to do the same. The galaxy far, far away mirrors our own world in ways both sobering and hopeful. The Empire is gone, but its shadow remains. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, and the cycle of tyranny and resistance plays out again and again across the stars. May we learn from the Empire's reign, treasure the freedom we have, and remain forever vigilant against those who would trade liberty for the illusion of safety.
The Force will be with you, always.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into the complete timeline of the Galactic Empire's reign, please hit that like button and subscribe to Sith Lore for more extensive Star Wars content designed to help you relax and fall asleep. Let me know in the comments what topic you'd like to see explored next. May the Force be with you, and sleep well.